Pro-Market and Pro-Business. Essays on Laissez-Faire. Part 1. Business Appreciation. Pro-market and pro-business. Both economists and libertarians often emphatically state, "I'm not pro-business, I'm pro-market." What does this slogan really mean? Sometimes they're just saying, "I oppose mandatory cartels, bailouts, subsidies, protectionism, licensing, and other government intervention on behalf of politically favored firms." This is a perfectly sensible position. But why would anyone call such favoritism pro-business? Sure, these policies help some businesses, but they're a burden on the rest. If you put a tariff on steel, you hurt domestic businesses that use steel. If you subsidize steel, you hurt businesses that make substitutes for steel. If you bail out the steel industry, other businesses will ultimately bear much of the cost. Often, though, the pro-market, not pro-business slogan is more about attitude than policy. It's a quick way to announce, "I don't favor markets because I like business people. Contra Ayn Rand, they're no heroes. Indeed, I'm quite suspicious of their motives. I favor markets because competition makes greedy, amoral business people toil for the social good." This is a coherent position, but on reflection, it is deeply misguided. Yes, business people are flawed human beings, but they are the least flawed major segment of society. If any such segment deserves our admiration, gratitude, and sympathy, it is business people. We should be pro-market and pro-business. Why, you ask? My prima facie case begins with this basic fact. Businesses produce and deliver virtually all of the wonderful, affordable products that we enjoy. Contrary to millennia of economic illiterates, businesses rarely do so by exploiting their workers. Instead, businesses provide gentle but much-needed leadership. Left to our own economic devices, most of us are virtually useless. We don't know how to produce much, and we don't know how to find customers. Business people solve these problems. They recruit workers, organize them to vastly raise their productivity, then put these products in the hands of customers all over the world. Yes, they're largely in it for the money, but unlike every government on earth, business rarely puts a gun to your head. Businesses assemble teams of volunteers to meet the needs of willing consumers and succeed wildly. But doesn't every business benefit from some act of government favoritism? Sure, but who doesn't? Before you dismiss anyone as a parasite, look at their net contribution, the difference between the government benefits they receive and the taxes they pay. I'm amazed by the chutzpah of professors at public universities who sneer at Walmart for negotiating with local governments for tax breaks. Walmart gets a modest discount from a government monopoly. You professors enjoy tax-funded dream jobs for life. Complaints about government favoritism carry a lot more weight, I'll admit, when businesses are close accomplices of the politicians who are handing out the favors. The defense industry bears no small part of the blame for the bloated defense budget. The health industry bears no small part of the blame for Medicare and Medicaid. But we should remember the many businesses that push in the direction of freedom. Imagine how hard it would be to build housing if the construction industry weren't constantly lobbying for permission to build. Imagine how little immigration there would be if employers weren't constantly lobbying for permission to hire. Populists may seethe with rage when business thwarts the will of the nativist NIMBY majority, but economists and libertarians should cheer. To their credit, both economists and libertarians routinely acknowledge that businesses provide good customer service. After all, firms have to protect their reputations. But this gives businesses too little credit. I love businesses because they treat me the way I like to be treated. When businesses want me to buy their products, they almost never nag, shame, preach, condescend, or troll. They make offers, politely say, "If you have any questions, you can reach me here," and then leave me in peace. I know business doesn't love me, but it would be awkward if it did. What I seek is common decency, and that's what business almost always offers. You could reply, "I understand your admiration and gratitude for business, but why sympathy?" Simple. Despite its many virtues, business remains a go-to scapegoat. Yes, business leaders are rich, but we unjustly treat them like our moral inferiors. Until business has society's respect, it has my sympathy. Many will think me naive, but there are few more disillusioned than I am. I don't believe that good or truth wins out in the end. I don't believe in the American system of government. I don't believe in the wisdom of the American people. I don't believe in religion. I don't believe in the media. I certainly don't believe in our education system. I believe in my immediate family, my closest friends, my own ideas. And business. It's not perfect, but it's still nothing short of a miracle. August 2nd, 2018. Always keep your eye on production. As a child, I was a bad baseball player because my mind wandered. Adults and teammates tried to improve my performance with a classic adage, always keep your eye on the ball. I didn't change, but their advice was excellent nonetheless. Laymen often criticize economics for its arcane complexity. When I talk with non-economists, though, so many gravitate toward Rube Goldberg stories. Random example. Yesterday, someone suggested to me that failing to fire underperforming government employees is actually economically beneficial, because secure jobs sustain the middle class, the crucial bedrock of our economy. When I encounter stories like this, I reply with an adage I urge my fellow economists to adopt. Always keep your eye on production. Whenever analyzing an economic problem, you should, by default, ignore Long's chains of social causation and ignore distribution. Instead, remember that mass production is the root cause of mass consumption. Then ask yourself, how will whatever we're talking about change the total amount of stuff produced? Application to yesterday's random example. What happens to production when lots of skilled workers enjoy pay and employment, even if they're unproductive? Production falls, impoverishing society. Subtler analyses must strive to keep sight of this basic truth. Always keep your eye on production superficially sounds free market or right-wing. But it's non-ideological. Think about tax policy. The adage urges us to forget distributional effects and focus instead on how taxes alter behavior, which along many prominent margins, they plausibly don't. Always keep your eye on production also reminds us to think long and hard about what production really is. When pondering pollution policy, for example, the saying makes us reflect. Is clean air, like a car, a valuable consumption good? As a moralist, I freely admit that my proverb could be misused. As a social scientist, however, I find always keep your eye on production wonderfully clarifying. Productive societies are rich societies. The rest is details. February 16, 2015. Firm Functionalism. My dear Martin, yet once more Pangloss was right. All is for the best. Voltaire, Candide. I have little sympathy for the Panglossian view that the status quo is socially optimal or even socially satisfactory. When I look at the world, I see vicious government policies, awful wars, and grotesque waste. You could chalk this up to my libertarian priors, and not without just cause. But in my defense, individual behavior often strikes me as sadly dysfunctional, too. People would be markedly happier if they second-guessed their impulses, built a beautiful bubble, and walked away from their own misanthropy. They don't, but they should. Still, one major form of social organization strikes me as highly functional, not merely from the point of view of the organizers themselves, but for society as a whole. Ironically, it is arguably the most maligned form of social organization, for-profit business. Though I freely acknowledge the many shortcomings of the business community, it is far more sinned against than sinning. How can I say this? When every intro Econ textbook has multiple chapters packed with models of socially dysfunctional business arrangements, by using my generic rebuttal, most of these accusations casually assume away crucial constraints. Once you take these constraints seriously, the performance of the business world is objectively outstanding. Let's start with mainstream economists' classic complaint about the market. Firms fall far short of the textbook model of perfect competition. Sure, they say, markets would be great if every industry had a vast number of tiny firms, but in the real world, perfect competition is rare. Indeed, if you define markets narrowly, e.g. upscale Italian restaurants within 5 minutes of my house, monopoly is everywhere. My specific rebuttal, perfect competition is socially optimal in industries with constant returns to scale. But in the real world, almost every industry has increasing returns to scale. Firms can produce twice as much at less than twice the cost, at least over a big range. Given increasing returns, it's good that we don't have tons of tiny firms. because each of them would have needlessly high costs of production. Yes, this allows successful firms to earn monopoly profits, but the opportunity to earn these monopoly profits is a great incentive to make and keep your firm great. When you see a big firm, don't ask, "Is this a monopoly?" On the textbook definition, the answer is almost always yes. But so what? The important question is, how did this firm become a monopoly in the first place? If your answer is something like, "By offering great products at low prices, you're seeing the world my way. Amazon, Netflix, Costco, Wegmans, I love you all." Next, take the textbook case against monopolistic competition. With homogeneous products, monopolistic competition is a clear waste of resources because every firm produces above minimum average cost. In the real world, however, monopolistic competition arises in industries with differentiated products. Why do firms differentiate their products? Because consumers value variety. This is even more important than it seems because variety takes many forms. Products don't merely physically differ from each other. They also differ in their location. A grocery store across the street is better for consumers than an identical store 30 minutes away. Indeed, the difference can be purely psychological. Sometimes a firm pleases consumers by weaving a fun image for a physically unexceptional product. Think Hatchimals. Cycling through the standard textbook complaints, critics often claim that markets perform poorly due to imperfect information. In the real world, though, businesses continuously help their customers cope with imperfect information. Firms have always taken reputation seriously. Now, with the rise of online reviews, they prize them. These reputations don't make information perfect, but they're extremely informative nonetheless. The same goes, naturally, when firms sell their products with a warranty. When consumers read 100% satisfaction guaranteed, they feel the weight of uncertainty lift from their shoulders. What about the twin evils of adverse selection and moral hazard? 5. Here, too, firms are tirelessly on the job. In the insurance industry, one of actuaries' main functions is to handle these frictions. Indeed, when you pay close attention, non-economists' main complaint about insurance is that firms charge riskier customers higher premiums. In a simple adverse selection model, firms would lack the knowledge to do so. Last case. In recent years, economists have resumed worrying about monopsony, or at least monosponistic competition. They're trivially right. Few workers can painlessly choose between thousands of competing employers. Once again, though, I say that when these market structures arise, they're socially functional. Monopsony allows firms to realize economies of scale. Economies of scale raise worker productivity, and higher worker productivity allows better pay and working conditions. An analogous point holds for monopsonistic competition. Just as monopolistic competition gives consumers product variety, monopsonistic competition gives workers job variety. Professors should have no trouble accepting this point. When we choose between two university employers, we don't just care about salary. We also consider colleagues, location, student quality, campus facilities, and much more. If gray uniformity is the price of perfect competition, just say no. General lesson. Instead of bemoaning monopsony, you should ask, how did this firm become a monopsony? If the answer is something like, by offering workers a better deal than the competition, take a deep breath and relax. Are there exceptions to the rule of firm functionalism? Of course. Business has yet to solve the grave evil of unemployment, though it's doing well for the time being. Firms have many creative remedies for externalities, but their response to both positive and negative externalities remains disappointing. Plenty of businesses engage in socially destructive lobbying, though I'd take them over populists and NIMBYs any day. And yes, when consumers like junk, firms mass-produce junk. See the astrology industry. Rather than fume, though, let us give thanks. Compared to the abundance and choice that business provides, these are minor failings. Business isn't just underrated. Business isn't just more socially functional than any other forms of social organization. Business is a shining role model for what human cooperation can accomplish. July 18, 2018. The Age of Contestability. When economists want to measure the competitiveness of an industry, they usually start by counting the number of competing firms. If they see a lot of firms, they infer a lot of competition. Few firms, little competition. One firm, no competition at all. 3 decades ago, a model came along to challenge this mindset, the contestable market model. In the contestable market model, a single firm often behaves exactly like a perfectly competitive firm. Why? Because of potential competition. Sure, your firm may be the sole supplier of a good right now, but if you raise your price above the competitive level, all sorts of competitors might suddenly spring up. To prevent this from happening, you need to keep your prices so low that no potential competitor bothers to become an actual competitor. The contestable markets model enjoyed immediate attention, but as you'd expect, believers in the traditional structure conduct performance model were not impressed. It doesn't Google, but I still remember Leonard Weiss' summary dismissal. It went something like this: the contestable markets model is empirically irrelevant and should play no role in policy. There hasn't been much new research on the contestability model in recent years, and I recently realized that the empirical and policy relevance of this much maligned model is now very hard to deny. Consider, the internet has given us a long list of near monopolies. Amazon, Apple, and Netflix are only the beginning. Funny thing, consumers love these monopolies. Despite their market dominance, these firms deliver amazing products at low prices, and almost no one is waiting for the other shoe to drop. If someone claimed that Amazon, Apple, or Netflix were planning to gouge us as soon as they devour their last competitors, we'd laugh. The contestable markets model has a simple explanation. Sure, Amazon, Apple, and Netflix look a lot like monopolies, but the people who run these firms can feel their potential competitors breathing down their necks. If these monopolies start taking their customers for granted, they'll quickly cease to be monopolies. Indeed, they may quickly cease to exist at all. In fact, the results we see are better than the simple contestability model predicts. Amazon, Apple, and Netflix don't just keep offering customers the same attractive terms. They're constantly trying to improve the terms they offer. Why? Because they realize that in the age of contestability, market leaders will fall behind unless they keep running full speed ahead. Yes, I know that Netflix recently burned up a lot of goodwill with some bad decisions, but consumers still love the product. March 6, 2012. Profit for progress. In economics textbooks, monopolies are socially dysfunctional because they raise price above marginal cost. This implies deadweight loss. Consumers' loss is not producers' gain. Picture a matinee at a movie theater. The marginal cost of admitting one more viewer is practically zero, but the price is still, say, $10 a seat. If someone values attendance at $9, charging him $10 destroys $9 of consumers' surplus without yielding a penny of profit. Economics textbooks also routinely claim that antitrust laws exist to mitigate this harm. What's strange, then, is that antitrust laws almost never simply punish firms for charging prices above marginal cost. 2. Yes, antitrust authorities try to change market conditions to make high prices less likely. Forbidding mergers in highly concentrated industries is a typical approach. But if Amazon, with all its monopoly power, doubled every one of its prices today, antitrust authorities probably wouldn't lift a finger. What justifies this inaction? If you pressed informed economists on this point, they'd probably say two things. First, many firms, especially firms in concentrated industries, have high fixed costs. Given this cost structure, pushing prices down to marginal cost wouldn't hand consumers a pile of cheap products. Instead, it would disastrously drive every business into bankruptcy. Second, the textbook model totally ignores what economists call dynamic efficiency. Sure, raising price above marginal cost implies deadweight costs today, but it also yields a monopoly profit. The opportunity to earn these monopoly profits gives entrepreneurs a powerful incentive to create and improve businesses. And that, of course, is how progress happens. Everyone, including everyone who pays monopoly prices, should smile to read the words, "If you come up with a great new business idea, you'll get rich," emblazoned above the gates of the world of business. Both of these arguments are solid. The first implies that antitrust authorities should definitely leave firms alone unless they're earning supernormal profits. The second implies that antitrust authorities should at least consider leaving firms alone, even if they are earning supernormal profits. Yet on reflection, neither argument justifies the status quo. The challenge: if it's bad to use antitrust to directly force prices down to marginal cost, why isn't it bad to use antitrust to indirectly force prices down to marginal cost. Suppose, for example, that HBO and Netflix want to merge. Antitrust authorities plausibly argue that this horizontal merger will substantially raise the prices consumers pay for premium entertainment. They're probably right, but the story doesn't end there. The knowledge that successful firms can legally merge increases the incentive to create successful firms. Not just successful firms in the entertainment industries, all firms. If you take dynamic efficiency seriously, you should at least be open to the possibility that the net economic effect is positive, the naive textbook monopoly model notwithstanding. The same goes for monopsony as well. If your business is awesome, you'll be able to pay your workers less than their marginal product. However, this in turn amplifies the incentive to make awesome businesses. Every worker should want to live in a world where this incentive is supercharged. Once you buy this argument, you'll see most other suspect business practices in a favorable new light. What's so bad, for example, if employers add a non-compete clause to their employees' contracts? 5. There may be some static inefficiency, but it's nice to live in a world where entrepreneurs know they can profit as they please if they make their firm great. Further point, dynamic efficiency may take and last a long time. The current success of Jeff Bezos isn't merely incentivizing his fellow 54-year-olds to make great businesses. Word of his fabulous fortune is already inspiring our business-savvy kindergartners. Verily, as Maximus says in Gladiator, "Brothers, what we do in life echoes in eternity." The way your culture feels about business matters. It's not crazy to think that the monopoly profits Rockefeller earned in the 19th century continue to fuel the ambition of the aspiring Rockefellers of the 21st century. Nor is it crazy to think that the antitrust case against Rockefeller continues to numb American entrepreneurship. If you build something great, the government just might decide to smash it, is a demotivating whisper. So should we learn to love monopoly? Not exactly. Business excellence is one route to monopoly power. The other, however, is government favoritism, which stifles static and dynamic efficiency alike. Is this really a big deal? Absolutely. Government routinely and deliberately crushes free competition, most egregiously with immigrant restrictions, housing regulation, and occupational licensing. If you really want to fight socially dysfunctional monopoly, don't urge government to tame monopoly. Instead, urge government to create less monopoly. We have a massive monopoly problem. But government is not a solution to our problem. Government is the problem. July 24, 2018. The dynamic case for non-compete. Here's Peter Menino's featured comment on my recent post. Isn't the entire case against non-compete clauses exactly that they stifle dynamic efficiency? Imagine if the traitorous 8 couldn't leave Shockley to found Fairchild Semiconductors, or Noyce & Moore couldn't leave Fairchild to found Intel. California's hostility to non-competes is one reason why we have a tech sector. I guess the problem is that some business practices prevent the world from being a place where entrepreneurs know they can profit as they please if they make their firm great. Plenty of people do indeed make this case against non-compete clauses, but their effect on innovation is far more complicated than it looks. Suppose you have a great new idea. To implement your idea, you have to share it with 8 crucial employees. But once you share it, any of these employees can take their knowledge and found a new firm to compete with you. In this scenario, non-compete contracts are actually a great way to foster competition. How? By reassuring businesses that if they invest in new ideas, their employees can't steal them at the first opportunity. What's the point of creating or implementing new ideas if your hired helpers can readily betray you? If this argument seems odd, notice that it's structurally identical to a simpler argument. For example, wouldn't it be great for innovation if every firm had to make all their business secrets publicly available for free? On the surface, this makes perfect sense. Every aspiring innovator could quickly learn everything that every existing innovator already knows. Cornucopia. On reflection, though, this would be dynamically disastrous. What's the point of coming up with new ideas in the first place if you have to give them all away gratis? Question: if I'm right, how can California be so innovative? My best guess is that existing non-compete clauses are so weakly enforced that there's little de facto difference between the law in California and the law in any other state. And in any case, The legality of non-compete clauses is only one of many ingredients of dynamic efficiency. So why care about this one? Because, per the Sorites paradox, even minor ingredients add up. Wise policymakers will focus on enhancing overall dynamic efficiency whether or not any specific policy seems especially crucial. July 27, 2018. Deludedly deeming deregulation a disaster. I posted this on Twitter 2 weeks ago. Suppose housing deregulation drastically increased housing supply. Housing prices fall 50%. Living space per capita doubles. What share of the U.S. population would nevertheless call housing deregulation a disaster? Less than 10%, 7.6%. 11 to 30%, 25.9%. 31 to 50%, 34.1%. 51% plus 32.3%. The results were much as expected. Housing deregulation could deliver everything its proponents promise. Housing deregulation could bring back a world where high school grads commonly buy shiny new homes in high-wage regions. And if my respondents are correct, this seemingly rosy scenario would still outrage a great swath of the population. Note, moreover, that if a third of Americans would decry deregulation as a disaster, then we can safely assume over half would at least deem it a mistake. Most people would probably chalk the disaster rhetoric up to human selfishness. But don't be hasty. Consider the myriad ways that homeowners could nevertheless selfishly benefit from deregulation. 1. Homeowners who own little or no equity could walk away from their small, expensive homes in favor of a larger, cheaper home. 2. Homeowners who eventually plan to move to a larger, more expensive home could easily find their losses on their old home are smaller than their savings on their new home, and they wouldn't have to wait as many years to upgrade. 3. The grown children of settled homeowners could much more easily afford to live near their parents, and wouldn't need so much help for a down payment. 4. Yes, higher local population means more congestion. Yet it also means better shopping, entertainments, and employment opportunities. What's the net value of all the good effects of more people bundled with all the bad effects of more people? The very fact that prices are much higher in densely populated areas strongly suggests that the net value is highly positive. New York would be great without all the people is sadly naive, because without all the people, New York would no longer be great. Upshot. When prices fall in half, established homeowners get at least some offsetting gain in consumers, surplus. 5. If you're willing to move, improve, or subdivide, deregulation allows even established owners with lots of equity to readily profit. If you suddenly gain the right to legally subdivide your lot into 3 home sites, a 50% fall in the value of the home you own is a fair price to pay. The same goes if you can now build up. Replace your home with a 10-story apartment and pocket the difference. Cha-ching. Do I seriously believe that many, perhaps most, existing homeowners will profit from deregulation? Earnestly, I do. Doesn't this mean that tens of millions of homeowners are simply confused? Indeed it does. Isn't that an absurd view? So it might seem until you realize that much of the population rents, but only a tiny minority of the population sees housing regulation as a problem. Deeper research confirms that renters strongly oppose deregulation too. 3. Since tenants are plainly deluded on this, why is it so hard to believe that homeowners are deluded as well? Personally, I own a lot of home equity and hope never to move. If housing prices fell 50%, it would directly cost me hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet even from a totally selfish point of view, I still say deregulation would be awesome. Why? Because I want my kids to be able to afford to live in my neighborhood when they grow up. Don't you? November 26, 2019. 2 tactical reasons to show business some love. Most economists admit that business serves socially valuable functions. When I express earnest appreciation for business, however, my peers usually respond by mocking Ayn Rand. The sarcasm sings, "Oh, those heroic entrepreneurs." When people selflessly toil for below-market pay, most economists eagerly endorse approbation. If you don't earn your marginal product in dollars, applause can nudge the world in the direction of optimality. But why on earth should we supplement businesses, pecuniary rewards with our smiles and applause? Rather than reiterate my controversial case for business, let me share two arguments with broader appeal. Why should we fawn over business people who already earn their marginal product? Because in the real world, they usually don't earn their marginal product. First, almost all businesses pay taxes. At the margin, then, they produce more value than they earn. So why not mitigate this disincentive with some gratitude? Imagine a world where the government annually thanked its biggest corporate taxpayers at a gala dinner. Is it possible that this would attract more talent and less materialistic talent into the business world? In the long run, moreover, it doesn't matter if the taxes are marginal or fixed. Marginal taxes discourage marginal production, while fixed taxes discourage entry. Second, almost all businesses are imperfectly competitive. Monopoly, oligopoly, monopolistic competition, take your pick. At the margin, these imperfectly competitive firms produce more value than they earn. Tax wedges and monopoly wedges both yield deadweight costs. And once again, public approval for business helps mitigate this waste. The more a firm produces, the more we should cheer. And even if this doesn't make individual firms produce more, it spurs entry. Are my proposed elasticities big enough to worry about? I think so. I meet lots of talented people. Almost all of them care about more than money. Some consciously crave social approval. Others seek personal meaning. But this, too, partly depends on the life choices their society chooses to lionize. If no one respects business, business has to rely solely on the efforts of the rare humans who do not crave respect. As long as we have taxes and imperfect competition, then we have pragmatic reasons to show business, and hence business people, some love. P.S. Did I mention that gratitude also feels good for the giver, making it an almost magically cheap way to reward others for their service? The leading exception is nonprofits, which most of us hold in far higher regard than conventional profit-seeking business. October 2nd, 2018. Business people earn every penny. Back in February, I got the idea to create a COVID vaccination t-shirt. Now on sale! Reflecting on my past experience, I figured it would be easy. Step 1. Run an illustration contest on freelancer.com, something I've successfully done several times before. Step 2. Take the winning entries to Zazzle.com, design some shirts, and sell them using the same interface, another thing I've done several times before, albeit on a small scale. My thinking, the whole process would be pretty fun, so I'd only need to sell a few dozen shirts to cover the cost of the contest and count the project a success. I'm still optimistic, but the process has definitely been much more aggravating than expected. A chronological list of snags. 1. One of my winning entrants warned me that the other two winners had copied their designs. Unpleasant news. 2. When I followed up, one of the accused was able to produce clear documentation that she had purchased the rights to her design. One problem solved. 3. The other accused contestant, however, seemed quite evasive about the situation. Or perhaps it was a language problem. I didn't like the idea of paying for an unusable design, but I also felt bad about refusing to reward one of my winners. After much prodding, he finally produced clear documentation that the images he incorporated into his design were in the public domain. Another problem solved, but the conflict weighed on me. 4. I was planning on immediately announcing that the 3 shirts were available for sale, but I decided I ought to order test copies for myself first. And figuring I was losing sales every day, I paid for rush delivery from Zazzle. 5. A couple days later, Zazzle sent me an email canceling the order. Why? They claimed that the sole fully original design violated copyright. Hopefully I'll work this out eventually, but apparently every drawing of a guy in a white suit at a disco infringes Saturday Night Fever. R. 6. I could have challenged the ruling, but instead I looked around for an alternative vendor. I figured they'd all be pretty similar, so I quickly settled on Printful. 7. Since I'd never done business with Printful, I had to place another test order. 8. After a couple days, Printful emailed me with a new problem. Printing a white, semi-transparent design on a black sweatshirt yields an unwanted gray color, so I went back and revised the order. 9. Soon afterwards, Zazzle let me know my canceled order was in the mail, rush order surcharge included. In the past, Zazzle canceled all items in an order if it flagged any item for copyright problems. Now, apparently, it sends everything that wasn't canceled. R. 10. A week later, I checked on my Printful order and discovered that I had somehow failed to click the final OK after revising the gray sweatshirt snafu, so my test order was still in limbo. Sigh. So I fixed it again, double stampies, no erases. 11. A few days later, I finally got my Printful order. The products looked good, I was ready to go. But when I went to the website to offer the products for sale to customers, I discovered that Printful, unlike Zazzle, makes selling designs a pain in the neck. To do business on Printful, I'd first have to sign up for a totally separate vendor website and then merge the two accounts. Arg. 12. After trying this for a half hour, I realized that I would be better off going back to Zazzle. So I dumped Printful and created a new Zazzle store, #FearMeNot, minus the disapproved design. Happily, the Zazzle interface seemed to work just as seamlessly as I remembered. You can order Fear Me Not. I got my COVID vaccine shirts, sweatshirts, and hoodies now. So at the end of this arduous and aggravating journey, I finally started selling my products to nudge the world back to normalcy. In a week or so, I'll try to convince the Zazzle copyright people that my third design is legit. Even if Saturday Night Fever does have a copyright on all images of disco dancers in white suits, my design should clearly be protected as parody. Overall, I think this will be a positive experience for me. The creative pleasure I've enjoyed plus the money I expect to make will probably exceed the subjective and financial cost of the dozen hassles I've already swallowed. Still, a few more hassles could easily change my mind, and selling t-shirts on Zazzle is virtually the lowest hassle business I can imagine running, which makes me picture the horrors of creating and managing an actual business. Indeed, I suspect that anyone who's ever run an actual business has been rolling their eyes at my self-pity. 12 little snags. Real entrepreneurs face more challenges every day. Unlike me, they have to coordinate a long list of products, each with their own attendant baggage. Unlike me, they have to manage a physical space. Unlike me, they have to hire and direct employees. And unlike me, they have to cope with the morass of government regulation. I don't care if actual business people do roll their eyes at me. Their can-do attitude in the face of endless obstacles still fills me with awe. Note further that in this very blog post I've already publicly complained more about my business woes than most business people ever will. Are they stoic? Do they realize that hardly anyone will sympathize with their plight? Or are they just too busy making the trains run on time to stop and reflect? All three answers make business people look admirable indeed. They don't just make the world work, they bear the suffering of the world in silence. No wonder I love them. 6. What motivates business people? While the full answer is complex, the basic answer is clear. Money. People run businesses to get richer, and ideally, to get rich. And whenever I get a small taste of the challenges business people overcome, not to mention the disrespect they endure in our society, I have to say that business people earn every penny. As someone who definitely does not want your job, entrepreneurs of the world, I thank you. P.S. Put your customers at ease with a #FearMeNot shirt. March 30th, 2021. The Partialtarian Corporation. Noam Chomsky calls corporations totalitarian without a hint of irony. I'd like to strengthen the federal government. The reason is, we live in this world, not some other world. And in this world, there happen to be huge concentrations of private power that are as close to tyranny and as close to totalitarian as anything humans have devised. The corporations are just as totalitarian as Bolshevism and fascism. They come out of the same intellectual roots in the early 20th century. So just like other forms of totalitarianism have to go, private tyrannies have to go. And they have to be put under public control. Maybe corporations are evil, but they're the opposite of totalitarian. Consider Mussolini's infamous definition of totalitarian. All within the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. Now think about how corporations treat their customers. They don't care who their customers are, they don't care about their customers' philosophies, they don't care how customers use their products. As long as customers pay up, corporations are content. So what do you call an organization that cares about one narrow goal and views everything else with indifference? Since we don't have a good word for it, I'll coin one: partialtarian. A totalitarian government wants to run every aspect of your life. A partialtarian corporation, in contrast, is only after one thing: your money. But what about employees? Corporations clearly pay a lot more attention to their workers than their customers. They care if you were out drinking last night. Discrimination law notwithstanding, they care if a woman has young kids. Many corporations even want team members to prominently use their products. If you work at a Mercedes dealership, your boss probably wants you to drive a Mercedes. Even here, though, corporations aspire to nothing like totalitarian control. The partialtarian ethos is always in the background. Do whatever you're like on your own time, as long as it doesn't detract from your work. Can you imagine Mussolini saying something like that? You could argue that corporations are cold. Maybe distillery CEOs should worry more about the families torn apart by alcoholism. Maybe tobacco CEOs should worry more about customers who die horrible, premature deaths. Maybe potato chip and television CEOs should worry more about obesity. But corporations' coldness is just the flip side of their extreme tolerance. Totalitarian governments try to control everything you do because they care about everything you do. Partialtarian corporations leave you alone because they only care about your money. Perhaps Chomsky would condemn corporations as callous, but I remind myself that the people who run corporations are strangers and thank them for minding their own business. August 28, 2013. Antitrust Kills. Since 2007, Bill Gates has given away $28 billion, 48% of his net worth. Frugal Dad estimates that he's saved almost 6 million lives. I haven't double-checked his sources, but it's a plausible estimate. Back in the 90s, Bill Gates was experiencing far less favorable publicity and legal persecution. The U.S. government sued Microsoft for antitrust violations. In 2000, Alex Tabarrok estimated that the antitrust case had cost Microsoft shareholders $140 billion. Yes, Microsoft ultimately reached a relatively favorable settlement. But Gates probably would have been billions richer if antitrust laws didn't exist. You might say, who cares? He can afford it. But hold on, we're talking about a great philanthropist. If Bill Gates were $5 billion richer, he almost certainly would have increased his charitable giving. A conservative assumption is that he would have stuck with his current ratio, giving away 48% of the extra $5 billion. It's quite possible that he would have given away every dollar. If Gates' philanthropy is as efficacious as most people think, there's a shocking implication. The antitrust case against Microsoft had a massive body count. Gates saves about one life for every $5,000 he spends. If the case cost him $5 billion, and he would have given away 48%, antitrust killed 480,000 people. If the case cost him $5 billion, and he would have given away every penny, antitrust killed 1 million people. Imagine how many people would be dead today if the government managed to bring Microsoft to its knees and Gates to bankruptcy. It staggers the imagination. You might object. By that standard, Gates himself is killing millions by failing to give even more. If you're a consequentialist, that's exactly correct. We're all murderers in the eyes of Jeremy Bentham and Peter Singer. But if we stick to the common sense distinction between killing and letting die, Gates is innocent and the government remains guilty. Outsourced to philosopher Michael Huemer. It is possible to harm someone not only by directly inflicting a harm, but also by actively preventing that person from taking actions to avert or remedy a harm. Suppose that, through no fault of mine, Marvin is in danger of starvation. He asks me for food. If I refuse to give him food, I thereby fail to confer a benefit on Marvin and, at the same time, allow Marvin to go hungry. If Marvin then starves to death, those who accept the doing/allowing distinction would say that I have not killed Marvin, but merely allowed him to die. And some believe that this is much less wrong than killing, possibly not even wrong at all. But now consider a different case. Suppose that Marvin, again in danger of starvation, plans to walk to the local market to buy some food. In the absence of any outside interference, this plan would succeed. The market is open, and there are people willing to trade food for something that Marvin has. Now suppose that, knowing all this, I actively and forcibly restrain Marvin from reaching the market. As a result, he starves to death. In this situation, I would surely be said to have killed Marvin, or at least done something morally comparable to killing him. The same holds, of course, if someone robs a philanthropist who otherwise would have come to Marvin's assistance. January 24, 2012. Capitalism. You look marvelous. The most unintentionally funny magazine in the world is Adbusters. The world's got to be pretty good if the only thing you have left to bemoan is Ronald McDonald. The letters to the editor are a scream, the bitterest people alive complaining about the pettiest problems imaginable. But behind all that inadvertent mirth, Adbusters has a theory. Advertising is designed by the greedy corporations to brainwash us into accepting their rule. Any decent economist can point out the hole in this theory. If the capitalists are so greedy, why don't they free ride? Why waste money making capitalism popular when your firm captures such a small slice of the benefit? Economist Dan Sutter develops this argument with great panache in his forthcoming book on the economics of the media. Yet recently I've begun to think that the Adbusters position can be partially salvaged. Less than a decade ago, I drove from former West Germany to former East Germany, and was struck by how much more beautiful the West was. Houses in the West had flower boxes. Houses in the East did not. I reflected that the aesthetic gap between West and East used to be vastly greater. And I recalled how people I knew who toured the Soviet bloc were more likely to sadly describe the grayness of communist life than the machine guns at the border. The upshot is that the private pursuit of beauty in the West had a striking externality. Every time a West German put a flower box in his window, he was making capitalism look prettier than socialism. And while intellectuals may say they couldn't care less about such things, I suspect that sheer aesthetics changed a lot of minds about East versus West. What does this have to do with advertising and commercialism generally? Corporations do not advertise to create support for capitalism, any more than West Germans planted flowers to fight communism. But advertising does more than just sell one firm's products. It also contributes to the beautiful image of the whole system. Flip through a popular magazine or wander through your local mall. Even if you don't remember a single product, you get an overall impression of a world that is colorful, fun, glitzy, and sexy. And that probably leads more people around the world to admire capitalism than Milton Friedman ever did. In other words, Adbusters is right to insist that advertising persuades people to like capitalism more. It does. But contrary to Adbusters, the corporations don't intend to do it. It just so happens that in their quest to make a buck, corporations make the whole capitalist system look marvelous. If you share Adbusters' anti-capitalist ethos, this will just cement your desire to squelch advertising to help make capitalism as ugly on the outside as it is on the inside. But if you appreciate the benefits of the free market, you've probably been underestimating the social benefits of advertising. After all, if the real arguments for capitalism failed to persuade, it may win anyway just for being so good-looking. July 13, 2005. Part 2. Free Market Economics Forever. Basic economics is intuitive. Economists often offhandedly remark that basic economics is counterintuitive. In one of the papers he presented at GMU, Scott Sumner has a whole appendix on why is economics so counterintuitive. Even my hands aren't clean here. In The Myth of the Rational Voter, I wrote that Smith's thesis, the harmony of private and public interest, was counterintuitive to his contemporaries and remains counterintuitive today. However, the more I think about it, the more I'm convinced that if basic economics seems counterintuitive, it's being poorly explained. If Bastiat could make Econ intuitive, so can we. To make my prima facie case, I'm going to present a few allegedly counterintuitive economic propositions, then explain them at a 6th grade level. 1. Counterintuitive claim. Free trade makes countries richer, even if the other countries have big advantages like cheaper labor or more advanced technology. Intuitive version. We'd be better off if other countries gave us stuff for free. Isn't really cheap the next best thing? 2. Counterintuitive claim. Strict labor market regulation is BSS bad for workers. Intuitive version. Employers don't like hiring people if it's hard to get rid of them. Suppose you had to marry anyone you asked out on a date. 3. Counterintuitive claim. Egalitarian socialism creates poverty, even starvation. Intuitive version. If everyone gets the same share whether or not they work, you're asking people to work for free. People don't like working for free, especially when the work isn't very fun. This is my response to Sumner's great leap forward challenge. But how do we explain to school children that millions had to starve because of a policy that encouraged people to share? 4. Counterintuitive claim. Prices are determined by supply and demand. Intuitive version. If the good were free, consumers would want a lot, but producers wouldn't feel like making much. If the good cost trillions of dollars, producers would want to make a lot, but consumers wouldn't want to buy any. In between, there's got to be a price where consumers want to buy as much as producers want to make. To deflect charges of cherry-picking, I'll open myself up to a challenge. State any proposition in basic economics in the comments, and I'll make it intuitive in a follow-up post. September 28, 2009. Econ as anatomy. Biology teachers often start their courses by reviewing the scientific method. Stripped down to essentials, this means 1. Formulate a hypothesis. 2. Run an experiment to test the hypothesis. 3. Tentatively accept your hypothesis if the experiment works. Otherwise, go back to step 1. This story isn't entirely wrong. Genetics really does begin with Mendel's plant hybridization experiments. If you thoroughly peruse a typical biology textbook, however, much of the content isn't based on experiments. Take anatomy. Do biology textbooks teach students about the circulatory system by describing experiments? No. Instead, they present and discuss a tidy diagram like this. Are the textbooks glossing over a pile of experiments from which these diagrams derive? Again, as far as I can tell, no. These diagrams are based not on experiments, but on something totally different. Painstaking observation. We don't know the heart pumps blood because we randomly assigned half the animals in a sample to have their hearts removed. We know the heart pumps blood because a bunch of smart people looked. The same goes for a vast body of anatomical truths. Where's the experiment testing the hypothesis that the stomach digests food? Or the experiment testing the hypothesis that biceps attach to the radius in the forearm? My point, of course, is not to criticize biology, but to understand it. Naive philosophers of science notwithstanding, biology is packed with useful, non-experimental knowledge. In principle, you could experimentally remove animals' stomachs and show that digestion stops. But you could use the same method to confirm the hypothesis that the brain digests food, because removing the brain also leads to the cessation of digestion, not to mention death. And in any case, what's the point of these experiments? The prevailing descriptive approach already provides fine answers. Methodological purists who cry, "Science is experimentation," aren't just silly. If we took their dogmas seriously, we'd have to throw away a vast body of precious knowledge. The contrast between rhetoric and reality is even stronger in my own field, economics. Economists are vocal proponents of the simplistic scientific method. If they can't present their work as experimental, they strive to label it quasi-experimental. But if you read an introductory economics text, virtually none of the content is based on experiments. Instead, good economics texts are packed with truisms based on calm observation of humanity. Incentives change behavior. Trade is mutually beneficial. Supply slopes up. Demand slopes down. Excess supply leads to surpluses. Excess demand leads to shortages. Externalities lead to inefficiency. These lessons are as undeniable as the heart pumps blood and the stomach digests food, but they're nevertheless supremely insightful and useful. Designing social institutions without considering incentives is as absurd trying to stuff food down people's lungs. But haven't economists learned quite a bit from experimentation? Of course, my own department is full of experimental economists. My point is that economics, like biology, is packed with precious non-experimental knowledge too. It's still science. Indeed, it's some of the best science ever done. We shouldn't let genuine triumphs of experimental method overshadow the rest of the field. And we should staunchly resist anyone who uses methodological dogmas to veto well-established truths, or selectively pretend they don't exist. Whether you're in biology or economics, writing textbooks won't get you tenure. But the non-experimental knowledge contained within these textbooks could easily be worth more than all experimental papers published in their respective fields in the last 50 years. What's the final verdict? For biology, I'm happy to defer to the biologists. For economics, however, I've been around long enough to confidently rule in favor of the textbooks. October 24th, 2017. Econ as incredulity. What is economic theory? Is it a body of proven truths, or a set of hypotheses whose only merit is that they've so far been successfully tested against the facts? Most economists openly embrace the latter position, but secretly believe the former. The smoking gun, The typical economist has well-defined views on a wide range of issues, even though he is only familiar with a handful of empirical literatures. If economists really believed their official methodological position, they'd be agnostic on the vast majority of topics. They aren't. How can economists resolve this tension? Hardline Austrian economists want the profession to renounce empiricism and admit that economic knowledge is a priori. The main problem with this position is that even claims as elementary as supply slopes up and demand slopes down are not a priori true. Hardline empiricists want the profession to remain utterly open-minded on every economic issue until they've reviewed the empirical evidence. The main problem with this position is that almost everyone who absorbs the economic way of thinking finds it to be incredibly clarifying and insightful. A good economist really can talk more intelligently about many topics he's never specifically studied than most non-economists who work on those topics full-time. But if the economic way of thinking isn't a body of truths, how can it provide such large epistemic benefits? My answer: economics provides clarity and insight by instilling selective incredulity. A trained economist knows when to say, "What? Really? And how can that be?" A few examples. 1. Living standards during the Industrial Revolution. Pure economic theory can't prove that a massive increase in production will make most people richer. But when someone claims that the Industrial Revolution made most people worse off, the economic way of thinking teaches us to be incredulous. Mass production failed to increase mass consumption? How is that possible? 2. Working conditions during the Industrial Revolution. Pure economic theory can't prove that the rise of the factory made workers better off. But when someone paints the Industrial Revolution as a disaster for workers, economics trains us to ask questions like, people moved to cities to get worse jobs than they had in agriculture. Immigrants wrongly believed they were likely to find a better life in the New World? And employers got rich paying workers far less than they were worth, and failed to provoke new entry? 3. The minimum wage. Pure economic theory can't prove that the minimum wage causes unemployment. But when someone denies this effect, a well-trained economist asks, the price of labor goes up by 20% and employers buy just as much? Come on. Or gee, why stop at $12 per hour? Why not $1,000 per hour? 4. Public goods. Pure economic theory can't prove that public goods are undersupplied. But when someone claims that we can solve massive social ills by asking for donations, the economic way of thinking kicks in. People enjoy the same benefit whether or not they contribute, but they still contribute on a massive scale? Economists, incredulity should be surmountable. Faced with our incredulous questions, economists should be ready to hear those we challenge say, yes, really. I understand your skepticism, but a very careful study of the evidence yields a surprising answer. The point of the economic way of thinking is simply to set the terms of the debate, to separate ordinary claims requiring ordinary evidence from extraordinary claims requiring extraordinary evidence. Critics may call this dogmatic, but it's no more dogmatic than scoffing at Bigfoot sightings. The reasonable reaction to Bigfoot really is to ask, a whole species of larger-than-man North American primates exists, but none of these animals has ever been captured, dead or alive. And the reasonable reaction to protectionism really is to ask, so we'll be richer if we prevent foreigners from selling us cheap stuff. December 9, 2013. The broader effects of trade and tech. Quite a few people consciously favor free markets, but not free migration. When questioned, many explain that unlike free markets in goods, free markets in labor have, quote, broad social effects. At this point, I have to suppress my urge to exclaim, are you out of your minds? They're right, of course, that free migration has broad social effects. They're crazy, however, to imagine that free markets in goods lack these effects. Indeed, at least within the observed range, ordinary market forces have changed society far more than immigration. Start with international trade. If the U.S. were a closed economy, manufacturing would still have shrunk, but it would remain a major source of employment. The Rust Belt would be doing far better and less eager for a populist political savior. Opioid and alcohol use among the working class would likely be considerably lower. Families would be more stable. College attendance and the college premium would have risen more modestly. More speculatively, church attendance would be higher, and nerd culture less dominant. The broader effects of international trade are, however, dwarfed by the broader effects of all the technological progress that market forces unleash. I remember life before the internet. When I was a teenager, I was almost completely intellectually isolated. Overcoming boredom was a constant challenge. There were no cyberbullies, we had real bullies instead. When I wanted to publicly speak my mind, I wrote letters to the newspaper. I had 0 friends outside the U.S. My parents and I were routinely out of contact for hours at a time. I still feel young, but I remember a world that most Econ log readers would find primitive. Nor is the internet an isolated example. The automobile has broad social effects. So did household appliances. So did modern contraception. Obviously. The pro-market, anti-migration thinkers could demur, yes, we all know that. Our real complaint is that the broader effects of immigration are generally bad, while the broader effects of international trade and technological progress are generally good. But if that's the real complaint, I say we're entitled to a careful accounting of these broader social effects. Who has even bothered to compile lists of these broader effects, much less try to measure them? If no one is doing the math, why would anyone think that broad social changes are benign? By the power of hindsight bias. Once a major social change happens, people just get used to it, with little doubt about whether the change was in fact a net positive. Immigration is, of course, the main exception. We can't imagine going back to a world without the internet, automobiles, or contraception. It doesn't ultimately matter whether their broad social effects are good or bad. We just have to live with them, because turning back the clock would require draconian tyranny. We can, however, imagine going back to a world with near-zero immigration, so fretting about the broader effects of immigration has great appeal. Wouldn't that require draconian tyranny too? Well, since the victims aren't fellow citizens, no. My personal view is that the broad social effects of international trade, technological progress, and immigration are all, on balance, positive. For immigration, I've done my homework. For trade and tech, I'm only guessing. What's clear, however, is that broader social effects are ubiquitous. Selectively invoking quote-unquote broader effects may be rhetorically effective, but it does not make you wise. July 10, 2019. Semi-Rivalry and Fiscal Externalities. Suppose a country has a progressive tax system. If everyone equally consumes government benefits, isn't everyone with below median income automatically a net fiscal burden, i.e., a person who withdraws more taxes from the Treasury than he contributes? Naive analysts usually assume that the answer has to be yes. More sophisticated analysts recognize, however, that some government services are non-rival. Once these goods exist, the marginal cost of allowing one more person to consume them is zero. National defense is a standard example. If we had a baby boom, no one would say, we'll need more nuclear weapons to protect these kids. Regardless of your views on foreign policy, the cost of defending N+1 people is no greater than the cost of defending N people. The higher the share of non-rivalrous goods in the budget, the easier it is for low-income taxpayers to carry, or more than carry, their own weight. Before you compare individuals' tax payments to their consumption of government services, you should subtract out all spending on non-rivalrous goods. For example, if 20% of government spending goes to non-rivalrous goods, you should compare individuals' tax payments to 0.8 average government spending. On reflection, though, this analysis is still woefully naive. In the real world, goods are not either 0% rival or 100% rival. There's a continuum. Some goods are close to the 0% pole, others to the 100% pole. But most goods are semi-rival, somewhere in the middle. Consider roads. Most roads are virtually empty in the middle of the night. The marginal cost of driving at 2 a.m. is only a slight amount of wear and tear on the asphalt. During rush hour, however, the marginal social cost of driving skyrockets. When you drive at 5 p.m., you aren't just slightly damaging the pavement, you're slightly inconveniencing thousands of other motorists. During mildly congested hours, the marginal cost is somewhere in between. Instead of classifying roads as either non-rival or rival, then you should admit that they're semi-rival. Then try to accurately place them on the continuum. In principle, switching from binary classifications, rival or non-rival, to continuous classifications, degree of semi-rivalry, could make our estimates of fiscal externalities more or less optimistic. In practice, however, the effect is strongly optimistic. Why? Because when empirical researchers use a binary standard, they usually treat rival as the rule and non-rival as the exception. Only goods close to the 0% rival pole, especially national defense, interest on the national debt, and R&D, go into the non-rival category. Everything else gets tossed into the rival category. If 20% of spending goes in the non-rival category, this approach implies that spending is 80% rival overall. With a continuous standard, reclassification has almost no effect on the classic non-rival goods. Fine, maybe they're 1% rival rather than 0%. But reclassification has a huge effect on the so-called rival goods. When you break them down, you could easily find that 1/4 are 25% rival, 1/4 are 50% rival, 1/4 are 75% rival, and 1/4 are 99% rival. Switching to continuous classification, therefore, brings overall rivalrousness from 0.2*0 plus 0.8*1 equals 80% down to 0.2.01 plus 0.2.25 plus 0.2.5 plus 0.2.75 plus 0.2.75 plus 0.2.99 equals 50%. Quite a shift. But doesn't this prove far too much? If most government services are semi-rival, doesn't the same hold for private goods? Of course. Look around. In most businesses, the marginal cost of serving one more customer is trivial. But there's no reason to run from this symmetry. In the private sector, people who buy bargain tickets do not burden customers who pay full fare. In fact, due to semi-rivalry, people who buy bargain tickets benefit full-fare customers by making a wider variety of flights profitable. The same can easily hold in the public sector as well. June 10, 2013. Absurdities of the Tiebout model. Economists across the political spectrum embrace the realism of the Tiebout model. The model's intuition. At the level of local government, there are consumers, i.e. residents and businesses, many suppliers, i.e. localities, and low switching costs, all the key ingredients of perfect competition. The upshot. We don't need to worry about the efficiency of the upshot. We don't need to worry local government policy. The quasi-free market will take care of things. To retain population in business, local governments of things. To retain population in business, local have go to offer a competitive package of taxes and benefits. Any government have to offer a competitive package of taxes and government that implements policies that fail a cost/benefit test benefits. Any government that implements policy that fail will by definition be unable to pass the market test. At the local cost/benefit test will by definition be unable to pass the market level, therefore whatever is efficient. To repeat, the Tiebout model enjoys bipartisan support. Liberal economists like the Tiebout model because it exempts at least one level of government from criticism. Conservative economists like the Tiebout model because it affirms the value of competition and decentralization. On reflection, however, the Tiebout model has big absurd implications. Absurdity number 1. There will be no redistribution at the local level. If a locality even slightly overcharges any segment of the population, the rich, the childless, business, whoever, for the services it receives, that segment will flee. Final resources redistributed, 0. Defenders of the model often actually claim that this implication is true, but there's an ironclad counterexample: public schools. Even today, public schools are heavily funded by property taxes, and the rate has nothing to do with the taxpayer's number of school-age children. In a Tiebout world, there would be immediate blowback. Childless residents would flee to their own separate, child-free, school-free, ultra-low tax district. Residents with one child wouldn't want to join them, but they wouldn't want to subsidize their more fertile neighbors either. They'd have their own separate one-child, small school, low-tax district, and so on. On further reflection, the Tiebout model also predicts far lower taxes on businesses than on residents. Unless there's slavery, business is inherently childless. Any locality that taxed business property to fund public schools would find itself bereft of business. Business would then relocate afoot from the residential locality's border and pay only the taxes necessary to pave the roads, patrol the streets, and put out the fires. To forge a mixed-use district, local government have to charge businesses lower tax rates than flesh-and-blood families. The one exception to the no Tiebout redistribution rule is redistribution that corrects local externalities. Tiebout governments might tax emissions to clean the air or impose congestion tolls to clear the roads. The catch, however, is that everyone who continues to reside in the locality must selfishly prefer the redistribution's indirect benefits to its direct costs. In a Tiebout world, any social insurance program would have to act like a for-profit insurance company. Rates would match risks, pure and simple. This means that the poor would probably pay not just higher tax rates for welfare or unemployment insurance than Bill Gates. Each poor person would probably pay more dollars of taxes for these programs than Bill Gates. After all, what is the probability that Gates will ever go on welfare? 1 in a billion? Absurdity number 2. There will be no waste at the local level. In the Tiebout model, local governments only supply goods if they have a cost advantage over the private sector. If a locality taxes a resident $1,000 to buy the resident goods that the market could supply at $900, the resident will move away, and a competing locality will eagerly accept his patronage. The only way to retain people and money, therefore, is to deliver the goods at the lowest possible cost. If the private sector does the job best, local governments will embrace laissez-faire. By this argument, if the private sector could supply education more cheaply than the public sector, there would be no public education. Unfair to the poor? That's not Tiebout talk. Yet the NEA need not despair. The mere fact that school vouchers haven't been adopted proves that public schools work better than any alternative, bloated budgets and illiterate students notwithstanding. The same goes for zoning, local licensing, massive parklands that almost no one uses, etc. Everything local governments actually do has to pass that quasi-market test, so who are economists to second-guess the result? Coming soon. The Tiebout model is wrong, in fact, but how can it be wrong in theory? December 12, 2012. Where Tiebout goes wrong. The Tiebout model implies that local governments will be redistribution-free and waste-free. If you find these predictions absurd, and you should, local governments must violate one or more assumptions of the Tiebout model. What are the key violations? 1. The lowest hanging fruit. Tiebout explicitly falsely assumes that local governments are perfect competitors. In the real world, though, local governments face a downward-sloping demand for residency curve. A locality does not lose all its residents simply because it offers a tax benefit package 1% worse than the district next door. 2. Tiebout implicitly assumes that dissatisfied residents can take their real estate with them. Virtually the opposite is true. So as David Friedman points out, and as one of my papers in Public Choice argues at length, the main effect of unfavorable tax benefits packages is not to induce migration, but to reduce property values. Ultimately, though, neither 1 nor 2 get to the heart of the problem with Tiebout. True, local governments aren't perfect competitors, but imperfectly competitive markets normally work fine. Ponder Amazon, Apple, or the restaurants in your neighborhood. Furthermore, 2 ignores reputation. Market forces may fail to protect current real estate owners in a locality, but local governments that somehow bind their hands, that are renowned for their aversion to redistribution and waste, should be far better at attracting labor and capital in the first place. The fundamental problem with Tiebout, rather, is Tiebout implicitly assumes that non-profit competition works the same way as for-profit competition. It doesn't. If a business owner figures out how to produce the same good at a lower cost, he pockets all of the savings. If the CEO of a publicly held corporation figures out how to produce the same good at a lower cost, he pockets a lot of the savings. But if the mayor of a city figures out how to deliver the same government services for lower taxes, he pockets none of the savings. That's how nonprofits work. With nonprofit incentives, neither the number of local governments nor the ease of exit lead to anything resembling perfectly competitive results. The competitors simply have little incentive to do a good job, so they all tend to perform poorly. To use an educational analogy, think about the difference between competition on a graded exam versus competition on an ungraded exam. In both cases, there are many competitors. But if the exam doesn't count, the competitors don't try very hard, so the average outcome is poor. You could object, of course, that the desire for re-election provides the necessary incentive. But A, the whole point of the Tiebout model is to show that local government delivers the goods regardless of the quality of the democratic process. And B, the desire for re-election often gives local politicians perverse incentives to pursue redistributive and/or wasteful policies. In the Tiebout model, a mayor who tried to replace overeducated, overpriced high school gym coaches would see his locality swell with residents and investment. In the real world, however, a mayor who tried to do this would be called a monster and thrown out of office. If you're a populist, you should be delighted by this outcome. If you're an economist, you should be horrified. No matter how you evaluate the outcome, though, one thing is clear. Contrary to the Tiebout model, local governments are not analogous to perfectly competitive firms. Not even close. December 31st, 2012. Why Libertarians should oppose the universal basic income. Here's my opening statement for my Students for Liberty debate with Will Wilkinson. Enjoy. Libertarians have a standard set of fundamental criticisms of the welfare state. 1. Forced charity is unjust. Individuals have a moral right to decide if and when they want to help others. 2. Forced charity is unnecessary. In a free market, voluntary donations are enough to provide for the truly poor. 3. Forced charity gives recipients bad incentives. If the government takes care of you, you're less likely to take care of yourself by work and saving. 4. The cost of forced charity is high and growing rapidly, leading to a future of exorbitant taxes or financial crisis. Taken together, I think these criticisms justify the radical libertarian view that the welfare state should be abolished. But this is an extremely unpopular view, so it's natural for libertarians to consider more moderate reforms like the universal basic income. And when you're considering moderate reforms, the right question to ask isn't, is it ideal, but is it better than the status quo? My claim, the universal basic income is indeed worse than the status quo. In fact, all the fundamental criticisms of the welfare state apply with even greater force. 1. Some forced charity is more unjust than other forced charity. Forcing people to help others who can't help themselves, like kids from poor families or the severely disabled, is at least defensible. Forcing people to help everyone is not. And for all its faults, at least the status quo makes some effort to target people who can't help themselves. The whole idea of the universal basic income, in contrast, is to give money to everyone, whether they need it or not. Of course, the UBI formula normally reduces the net payment as income rises. But if a perfectly able-bodied person chooses never to work, the UBI gravy train never stops. 2. The UBI is an extremely wasteful form of forced charity. Helping the small minority of people who can't help themselves doesn't cost much. Giving an unconditional grant to every citizen wastes an enormous amount of money. If you were running a private charity, it would never even occur to you to help everyone, because it's such a frivolous use of scarce charitable resources. Instead, you'd target spending to do the most good. And unlike the UBI, the status quo makes some effort to so target its resources. 3. Overall, the UBI probably gives even worse incentives than the status quo. Defenders of the UBI correctly point out that it might improve incentives for people who are already on welfare. Under the status quo, earning another $1 of legal income can easily reduce your welfare by $1, implying a marginal tax rate of 100%. But under the status quo, vast populations are ineligible for most programs, such as you guys. If you're an able-bodied adult, aged 18 to 64, who doesn't have custody of any minor children, the current system doesn't give you much. Switching to a UBI would expand the familiar perverse effects of the welfare state to the entire population, including you. And if taxes rise to pay for the UBI, the population-wide disincentives are even worse. 4. A politically acceptable UBI would be insanely expensive. Libertarian economist and UBI advocate Ed Dolan has a detailed fiscally viable plan to provide a UBI of $4,452 per person per year. But every non-libertarian I've queried thinks it should be at least $10,000 per person per year. Even with a one-third flat tax, that implies that a family of 4 would have to make $120,000 a year before it paid $1 of taxes. This is pie in the sky. But doesn't the UBI give people their freedom? In some socialist sense, sure. But libertarianism isn't about the freedom to be coercively supported by strangers. It's about the freedom to be left alone by strangers. If abolition of the welfare state is extremely unlikely, and the UBI is worse than the status quo, does this mean libertarians should accept the welfare state as it is? Not at all. There's a straightforward moderate path to a freer world. Austerity. Cut benefits. Restrict eligibility. Remind the world of the great forgotten man, the taxpayer. We probably can't convince the majority to end the welfare state. But welfare should be limited to genuinely poor people who can't help themselves has broad appeal. And unlike the UBI, it's a clear step in the libertarian direction. February 20th, 2017. Milton and Friedman opposed a Pareto improvement. One of Milton Friedman's most famous lines: "You cannot simultaneously have free immigration and a welfare state." He said it in a 1999 ISIL interview, and I've heard it quoted dozens of times. It even inspired me to write a champion scenario, the law of unintended consequences. On reflection, Friedman's wrong. Yes, the U.S. welfare state pays more than most people on Earth earn. But once immigrants arrive here, few of them want to settle for a welfare check. They want to earn some real money. In fact, once you realize that the welfare state is primarily about helping the old, not the poor, it turns out that immigration may be the only way for aging countries to sustain their welfare states. But I digress. Right or wrong, Friedman's claim about immigration and the welfare state is entirely in character for him. I was shocked then to read his response to a follow-up question in the ISIL interview. Q. Instead of a green card, resident alien status, can the USA issue a blue card which does not give welfare? A. If you could do that, that would be fine. But I don't believe you can do that. It's not only that it is not politically feasible, I don't think that it is desirable to have two classes of citizens in a society. We want a free society. We want a society in which every individual is treated as an end in themselves. We don't want a society in which some people are in there under blue conditions, others are in there under red conditions, others are in there under black conditions. We want a free society. So I don't believe such. I haven't really ever thought of that system. It's a new question. I very rarely get a new question, but I must admit that's a new question for me. And I haven't really thought about it a great deal, but my initial reaction is that it's a very undesirable proposal. Granted that Friedman was 87 when he said this, it's still appalling. Normally, Friedman was eager to embrace any marginal measure in the direction of liberty. But on immigration, he bizarrely turned his wish for a free society into an argument against a compelling libertarian improvement over the status quo. And how in the world is telling people you can't come here because you might collect welfare an example of treating people as an end in themselves? My last, best way to rescue my intellectual idol is his admission that he'd never thought about the proposal before. But isn't that bizarre? Friedman, who could run mental circles around lesser geniuses, never asked himself, what is the least unlibertarian way to deal with the conflict between free immigration and the welfare state? The lesson, perhaps, is that what Tim Harford calls keyhole surgery, looking for the least intrusive solution to market and/or political failure, is a major intellectual advance, obvious in retrospect, but deeply counterintuitive nonetheless. June 7, 2008. A simple proof that national defense is not a public good. National defense is a textbook example of a public good. Unlike Austrians, I have no problem with the concept of public goods. I just deny that national defense is a valid example. In fact, I will be so bold as to claim I can prove that national defense is not a public good. Proof. 1. For national defense to be a public good, the social benefits of its existence must exceed its social costs. From the definition. 2. The social benefits and costs of national defense are the sum of all people's willingness to pay. By definition. 3. On average, people's willingness to pay for their own physical security is higher than their willingness to pay to reduce the physical security of others. My critical assumption, which I'll call limited malevolence. 4. If no country had national defense, people's average physical security would be higher than it is now, because the danger which any given country's national defense deters is attacks from the national defense of other countries. 5. Since the existence of national defense reduces people's average physical security from 4, and people's average willingness to pay to increase their own physical security exceeds their average willingness to pay to reduce the physical security of others from 3, the net social benefits of the existence of national defense are negative. 6. Therefore, from 1 and 2, National defense is not a public good, QED. If you wanted to reduce my proof to a slogan, it would be, national defense. If no one had it, no one would need it. If textbooks were accurate, they would drop national defense as an example of a public good and replace it with the abolition of national defense. Unfortunately, I fear that even the typical economist is too nationalistic and hawkish to take my proof seriously. October 24, 2009. In Sync: How Business Responds to Gratis Government. Whenever people criticize government provision of a product, clever analysts often demur that private suppliers who compete with government have exactly the same problems. Part of Helland and Tabarrok's case for the Baumol effect in education, for example, is that prices have risen at the same rate in both the public and private sectors. Prices are much lower at public than at private institutions. The vertical scale is a ratio scale, so equal slopes mean equal rates of growth. Thus, although prices are lower at public institutions, the rate of growth in prices has been similar at private and public institutions. Between 1980 and 2015, real prices more than doubled. Okay, let's step back. Picture a typical government service. The price, gratis. The quality, mediocre. Private competition, however, remains legal. Should we expect the private part of the market to look just as it would under laissez-faire? No way! Unless the government rations the free mediocre product, consumers have virtually no reason to ever pay for products of mediocre or lower quality out of their own pockets. At minimum, then, government's gratis products kill private production of all products of equal or lower quality, a textbook case of predatory pricing. That's not all. Gratis production also effectively kills private provision of products of moderately higher than mediocre quality. After all, if you can get a C+ product for free, who wants to pay full price for a B- alternative? With gratis public provision, private providers must convince consumers that the marginal quality improvement is worth the total price of the product. A tall order. What does this mean? Well, if public schools add more low-value services, private schools must keep pace in order to compete. If public schools add more sports, more specialized teachers, or more courses, private schools that fail to keep up will lose their customers. The first rule of private competition against gratis government is, always keep your product quality well above the government's. This remains true even if the government adds services that consumers value well below cost. If you can get them for free from the government, why pay extra for a private school that refuses to offer them? The lesson: when government supplies free or highly subsidized products, we should expect private suppliers to supply gold-plated versions of the standard government issue. As a result, their prices and costs will be closely synced. There are admittedly some exceptions. If government is spending money for no gain at all, private competitors needn't bother. If government supplies numerous expensive low-value services, private competitors might decide to just outshine the government on other dimensions. Most realistically, if government refuses to provide some cheap, highly valued options, such as religious education, then private competitors can win customers by filling the gap. Yet overall, when there is a dominant public sector with a private fringe, we should expect the Helen-Tabarrok pattern, without a Baumol effect. Given the pathologies of the public sector, it's nice to have a private option, but don't get too excited. The private options will generally be extravagant, because gratis government strangles budget-friendly alternatives. Tragically, this in turn sustains the illusion that in the absence of government, only the rich would be able to afford whatever the government now provides. P.S. Another reason to expect public and private education to closely resemble each other is that both are almost always nonprofit. Morally, yes, there is a major difference between public and private nonprofits. Economically, however, they're very much alike, because both give managers flimsy incentives to raise value or cut costs. June 12, 2019. Opting out. Do efficiency and liberty really conflict? As a corollary to the proposition that all institutions must be subordinated to the law of equal freedom, we cannot choose but admit the right of the citizen to adopt a condition of voluntary outlawry. If every man has freedom to do all that he wills, provided that he infringes not the equal freedom of any other man, then he is free to drop connection with the state, to relinquish its protection, and to refuse paying towards its support. Herbert Spencer, the right to ignore the state, social statics. If I don't want a government service, why can't I stop paying for it if I stop consuming it? In a phrase, why can't I opt out? It's a question libertarians like Herbert Spencer have been asking for quite a while, and it's got a lot of intuitive appeal. If I don't send my kids to public school, why can't I get a refund of the fraction of my property taxes devoted to education? Economists usually view this question as the height of naivete. Of course you can't opt out. Government provision wouldn't work if people could stop paying taxes for services they say they don't want. On reflection, though, there are at least 3 distinct reasons why opting out would kill government provision. 1. Strategic reasons. Due to externalities, people continue to enjoy most or all of the benefits of the government service after they officially opt out. So there would be an incentive to opt out even if you did prefer having the good plus paying the associated taxes to not having the good plus not paying the associated taxes. 2. Redistribution. Some people are paying more than they are getting. Others are getting more than they are paying. So there would be an incentive for all net losers to opt out, making redistribution unsustainable. 3. Wasteful spending. People genuinely value the good at less than its cost. End of story. Now notice that only one has anything to do with economic efficiency. If opting out is purely strategic, then opting out leads government to stop providing goods that people value at more than their cost. The honest libertarian could still say that liberty is more important than economic efficiency, but he'd have to admit that there's a conflict. However, in cases 2 and 3, matters are different. In case 2, opting out would make redistribution unsustainable. But that's not an efficiency problem. In fact, since redistribution almost always has some deadweight costs, letting people opt out would increase efficiency. The libertarian policy leads to marginally greater economic efficiency. In case 3, the situation is even more stark. If people opt out simply because people value a good at less than its cost, then economic efficiency demands opting out by definition. The libertarian policy is required for economic efficiency. During my time in economics, I've noticed that mainstream economists are very quick to assume that all opting out is strategic. But that's not true, even in the clearest cases. Take national defense. These days, many leftists would clearly like to opt out and put scare quotes around defense. We can fairly say that most of this is not strategic. Not only do they value e.g. U.S. policy in Iraq at less than its cost, they would probably pay to reverse U.S. policy in Iraq. And if that's true for national defense, it's even more clearly true for things like public education. We can pretend that opting out is strategic, but the real reasons are that it's redistributive, from families that don't use the public schools to those that do, and wasteful. Even families that do use the schools often value the services at less than the cost in taxes. Bottom line, libertarians should admit that there are special circumstances where opting out leads to economically inefficient outcomes. But economists should admit that these are special circumstances that actual government spending often fails to satisfy. The economist who points out the splinter of naivete in the libertarian's eye ought to look at the beam of naivete in his own. June 11, 2006. The Public Goods Model versus Social Desirability Bias, a case of observational equivalence. Imagine a world where no one ever voluntarily buys good X. Still, everyone affirms that X is very important, a vital good. If you hold an election, the population unanimously votes in favor of very generous funding for X. Most economists will instantly conclude that X is a public good. It all makes sense. Everyone knows that X is valuable. Everyone free rides if given the opportunity. Yet everyone eagerly votes to force everyone to support X. Case closed. I say that economists are dead wrong to close this case. A competing science has an equally compelling theory to fit these facts. The science, psychology. The theory, social desirability bias, SDB. SDB begins with a simple observation. When lies sound better than the truth, people often lie. Wikipedia lists some standard examples. Personal income and earnings, often inflated when low and deflated when high. Feelings of low self-worth and/or powerlessness, often denied. Excretory functions, often approached uncomfortably, if discussed at all. Compliance with medicinal dosing schedules, often inflated. Religion, often either avoided or uncomfortably approached. Patriotism, either inflated or, if denied, done so with a fear of other parties' judgment. Bigotry and intolerance, often denied, even if it exists within the responder. Intellectual achievements, often inflated. Physical appearance, either inflated or deflated. Acts of real or imagined physical violence, often denied. Indicators of charity or benevolence, often inflated. Illegal acts, often denied. Example, if you ask people, should people help their mothers more? They'll probably respond, yes. Why? Because helping mothers sounds good. It sounds so good, in fact, that no matter how much help mothers receive, almost no one will ever openly advocate helping them less. That's SDB for you. Exactly the same applies if you ask people, should government do more to help the sick? People will probably say yes, no matter how much government already helps the sick. Why? Because helping the sick sounds good. If people were as logical as Steve Landsberg, they'd instantly protest. X being good is a reason to do a lot of X, not a reason to do more X. But these words sound terrible, so only courageous thinkers like Steve utter them. Psychologically, normal humans say the words other people want to hear. So how precisely is SDB an alternative to the public goods model? Return to the facts in the opening hypothetical. How come no one voluntarily buys X? Because people don't actually like X, at least not enough to pay for it. Why does everyone praise X? Because praising X sounds good. Why do people unanimously vote for lavish spending on X? Because voting is just a special kind of talking. Admittedly, it's hard to believe that everyone praises X, even though no one values X. But it's equally hard to believe that no one is willing to voluntarily pay for X, even though everyone values X. Ever heard of charity? The opening hypothetical is unrealistically stark, so every model that purports to explain it sounds stilted. However, if we tone the hypothetical down to realistic levels, both the public goods model and social desirability bias are quite credible. Take teen marijuana use. Lots of people complain about it. Hardly anyone voluntarily pays to discourage it. Yet most democracies heavily persecute it. Public goods theory provides one explanation. The complainers are largely sincere but routinely free ride off each other. Government is the solution. It forces these free riders to provide the funds required to realize their dream of marijuana prohibition. Social desirability bias provides a very different explanation. The complainers barely care despite their pious platitudes. Government is the problem. It forces these otherwise harmless big mouths to put their money where their mouths are. The result is a costly crusade against a problem most people would prefer to neglect. Once you start taking the observational equivalence of the public goods model in SDB seriously, you can try to overcome it. More observations are useless, but different observations may do the trick. In particular, the two stories make very different predictions about migration and real estate markets. The public goods model predicts that alleged government solutions will attract migrants and raise rents and housing prices. People crave governments that give them what they say they want. SDB, in contrast, predicts that alleged government solutions will repel migrants and reduce rents and housing prices. People secretly desire governments that take their pious talk with a grain of salt. So which story is right? My best guess is both. The world is full of public goods problems, but the world is also full of self-righteous posturing. Psychology's lesson for economics, strangely, is that we should stop taking voters at their word and focus instead on how consumers spend their housing dollars. September 4th, 2012. Part 3. Actually Existing Government. The welfare state as extended warranty. Extended warranty? How can I lose? Homer Simpson. Value is subjective, and taste for risk varies widely. But every economist I've asked, and virtually every savvy consumer, concludes that extended warranties are a lousy deal. The short case against extended warranties. 1. You normally get a very good warranty for free. When you buy an extended warranty, you only receive a marginal increase in security. 2. This marginal increase is usually grossly overpriced. You often pay 20% of the purchase price to protect yourself against a 1% risk. 3. In any case, by the time your extended warranty kicks in, your product has already lost most of its value. Most of the time, the vendor just repairs and returns your original, semi-obsolete device. The lesson: even if you're a deeply anxious person, self-insurance is the prudent course. Just take your chances and use all the money you save to buy replacements when the need arises. If extended warranties are such a bad deal, why are they so popular? Psychological bias. Vendors are preying on your absurd yearning for certainty, your desire to know that you'll never lose what you have. Why absurd? Because true certainty is unavailable at any price. Can you be certain that the vendor will remain in business? No. Can you be certain that the vendor will honor the contract? No. Can you even be certain that you'll still be alive tomorrow? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. Extended warranties sell because they provide the illusion of certainty, and many human beings are too soft-headed to disbelieve the illusion. Readers often misinterpret The Myth of the Rational Voter as arguing that people are rational in markets but irrational in politics. My actual view is simply that people are markedly more irrational in politics than in markets. Given the bustling market in extended warranties, then, my natural reaction is to ask, does this absurd yearning for certainty play an even larger role in politics? My answer is a resounding yes. The absurd yearning for certainty lies at the heart of support for the welfare state. Think about the populist case for fully socialized medicine. What's supposed to be so great about it? The certainty. You know that no matter what happens, the government will provide your health care. Of course, this certainty is merely rhetorical. Can you be certain that the government will cover the treatments you actually need? No. Can you be certain that the government will competently deliver whatever treatments it covers? No. Can you even be certain that your medical problems are curable? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. What is the point of this rhetoric of certainty? To confuse voters so they don't ask the questions that matter to savvy consumers. Namely, 1. What is the marginal health benefit of socialized medicine? 2. How much extra does the government charge for this marginal health benefit? If voters did ask these questions, they'd find considerable evidence that government health spending, like extended warranties, is a crummy deal. You pay an arm and a leg, and the marginal improvement in health is slight. The same goes for government retirement programs. What's so great about Social Security? You know that no matter what happens, the government will provide your retirement income. But once again, this certainty is merely rhetorical. Can you be certain that Social Security will give you a decent standard of living? No. Can you be certain that Social Security will suffice for your basic needs? No. Can you even be certain that you'll still be eligible for Social Security by the time you retire? The answer, I'm afraid, is no. But the rhetoric of certainty silences the awkward questions every savvy consumer should ask. 1. What marginal income security benefit does Social Security provide? 2. How much extra does the government charge for this marginal security benefit? If voters did ask these questions, they'd find that projected Social Security returns are pretty crummy for most people, even according to the Social Security Administration itself. The SSA's own estimates look worse yet when they factor in probable future changes in the benefit formula. There's certainty for you. Are there any important differences between the market's extended warranties and the government's welfare state? Sure, most economists will highlight a difference that makes the welfare state look better. Extended warranties usually insure against relatively small losses. The welfare state, in contrast, often insures against relatively large losses. These economists have a point, but exaggerate. The welfare state's biggest programs insure against the rather foreseeable problems of old age and unprotected sex. Relatively few economists, though, will highlight a difference that makes the welfare state look worse. If you don't want an extended warranty, all you have to do is tell the vendor, "No thanks, I'll take my chances." Once you realize that extended warranties are a bad deal, you never have to get ripped off again. The welfare state, in stark contrast, won't take no for an answer. Once you realize that the welfare state is a bad deal, the rip-off continues until the day you die. Or flee the country. September 25, 2014. On the complexity of the world. Confession. I have been enamored of extreme policies for as long as I can remember. When I was around 10 years old, for example, I decided that all smokers should be summarily executed. Adults' attempts to rebut my visionary proposals usually proved counterproductive. Why? Because they came off as completely evasive. They almost never engaged the specifics of my ideas. Instead, the typical adult condescendingly told me, "You don't understand the complexity of the world." Such vague objections, I decided, were a clear sign that my juvenilia was rationally unassailable. One of the biggest lessons I've learned in the meanwhile, the complexity of the world argument, CWA, is deep and important, even though most people lamely trot it out when they can't think of anything concrete to say. I started to reassess the CWA when I discovered economics. One of Intro Econ's main lessons, after all, is that feel-good policies often have bad indirect consequences. Imposing a price ceiling on food doesn't just make food cheaper. It also discourages the production of food and fosters black markets and rent-seeking. Banning pre-existing conditions clauses doesn't just help sick people get affordable insurance. It also makes insurance more expensive and encourages healthy people to drop out of the risk pool. When economists like Mises drew the more general lesson that the failures of government intervention naturally spiral into further interventions, it blew my mind. Stories like these didn't merely demonstrate that the CWA had some real-world relevance. More importantly, they showed that intellectually powerful yet socially invisible arguments exist. I haven't heard anyone provide a good argument against X is only weak evidence in favor of X, because good arguments are routinely, widely overlooked. The longer my economic education continued, the more relevant the CWA seemed, especially when I discovered that strong objections are often vulnerable to even stronger rebuttals. Branching out into psychology showed me that I'd been blind to a whole world of additional insights. In time, however, I realized that there's another field that illustrates the CWA better than any other: history. Fact: a brutal communist dictatorship rules North Korea in 2014 because one Serbian shot one Austrian in 1914. If you know basic history, this seemingly bizarre claim should be obvious. In 1914, however, this ripple effect was so utterly non-obvious that no one on Earth is likely to have considered it. Disagree? Look at how bad even experts are at far less remote predictions. Once you merge basic history with the biological fact that none of us would be here if our fathers had crossed their legs one more time, the CWA becomes overwhelming. The tiniest change in your reproductive behavior eventually changes the identity of every living human. And some of those humans will make choices that affect billions. The tiniest change in the behavior of Lenin's parents prior to his conception would have annulled his existence, and a world without Lenin would be a very different world than the one we've known. After you stare into the face of the CWA, there's no going back. The only question is, how can you live with it? Once you fully absorb the CWA, confidence in your long-run, big-picture predictions sharply falls. If you adhere to norms of rationality and candor, the CWA requires you to moderate your claims and alienate the overconfident masses that surround you. If you're a strict consequentialist, belief in the CWA is almost paralyzing. How are you supposed to maximize overall X if long-run, big-picture predictions are so tenuous? How? From other ethical perspectives, however, the CWA cuts the Gordian knot of indecisiveness. Suppose you have a modest moral presumption against murder. The CWA reminds you that such scruples could easily have bad, long-run consequences. After all, you could be sparing an ancestor of the 23rd century's Hitler. But the CWA also saps the strength of every attempt to defease your presumption against murder. It is nigh impossible for a reasonable person to be 90% confident that murdering a seemingly harmless person will ultimately make the world a better place. The upshot: the CWA, combined with homely moral presumptions, logically leads to a bunch of extreme policies, not summarily executing smokers. I was totally wrong about that, and so much else. But the CWA does elegantly support policies like libertarianism, pacifism, tolerance, and general passivity. In a world as complex as our own, you have no compelling reason to get your hands morally dirty. Just leave other people alone, wish them well, and beautify your bubble. November 21st, 2014. Regulate the state. Sometimes an organization has overwhelming power. If you don't like it, go elsewhere isn't a serious remedy. It's a thinly veiled order to shut up and submit. In such cases, we should seriously consider breaking the overpowered organization into smaller parts to restore competition. Until competition returns, however, regulation is a helpful stopgap. Just because you own an essential resource doesn't entitle you to use it however you please. And that's why government should be strictly regulated. If any organization has monopoly power coming out the wazoo, they do. Leaving your country is an enormous burden for the average person. Furthermore, the worse your country is, the less likely other countries are to admit you. Using the political process to redress abuse is a pipe dream, even if you're a citizen. And if a foreign government mistreats you, your only real recourse is to beg for mercy. What kind of regulations should governments face? Some are already on the books in some places. Free speech, freedom of religion, bans on uncompensated expropriation. But as a practical matter, the world's governments remain virtually unbridled. Almost nothing stops governments from charging exorbitant taxes for shoddy services. This has to end. For example, governments could be required to tax each individual no more than twice the fair market value of the services they receive. And an outside body, not dependent on the government, should set fair market value. Almost nothing stops governments from negligently killing innocent foreigners. This has to end. For example, governments could be required to prove that any foreigners they kill in military action were in fact hostile combatants. An outside body, not dependent on the government, should weigh this evidence. Any government that fails to meet this burden should be forced to pay millions of dollars of restitution per presumed victim. Almost nothing stops governments from strangling construction, leaving most of the population without affordable housing. This has to end. For example, governments that disallow a construction project could be required to prove that it poses a clear and present danger to human safety. An outside body, not dependent on the government, should adjudicate this. Any government that fails to meet this burden should be held in contempt of court and removed from office. Almost nothing stops governments from callously excluding desperate foreigners. Even if you're likely to die without asylum, governments can casually refuse. This has to end. For example, governments could be required to prove that asylum seekers will be safe in their home countries if they aren't admitted. An outside body, not dependent on the government, should make the call. Any government that defies its decision should be fined millions of dollars of restitution per victim. If your reaction to any of these proposals is to talk about sovereignty, you're part of the problem. Granting a restaurant owner full sovereignty is harmless because it's just one restaurant. Granting a government full sovereignty, in contrast, is a recipe for massive, habitual abuse. We need to stop imagining that they're sacred or entitled to do whatever they want with what they own, and we have to stop pretending that democracy is an effective check. What good is democracy if you're perpetually in the minority? What good is democracy if you can't vote because you're not even a citizen? Lately, I've been hearing numerous demands to regulate Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter. I think these demands are overblown because countless excellent, viable substitutes remain. But the pro-regulation activists' fundamental premise is not crazy. Regulation can and should rein in grotesquely abusive monopolies who act like they're entitled to treat people like dirt, and every government on earth readily fits this description. Yes, even Norway. Let's get governments fully under control, then argue whether search engines and online superstores are in the same league as the monopolists par excellence. September 18, 2018. Market failure theory as reproach to government practice. The theory of market failure is a reproach to the free market economy. Unless you have perfect competition, perfect information, perfect rationality, and no externalities, you can't show that individual self-interest leads to social efficiency. And this anti-market interpretation is largely apartment. You can't legitimately infer that markets are socially optimal merely because every market exchange is voluntary. Contrary to popular belief, however, market failure theory is also a reproach to every existing government. How so? Because market failure theory recommends specific government policies, and actually existing governments rarely adopt anything like them. What do I have in mind? 1. When markets produce too much of something, market failure theory tells governments to impose corrective taxes that correspond to the severity of the excess, then let people do as they please. In the real world, in contrast, governments normally pass a phone book's worth of regulations. They rarely consider the cost of the regulations, and almost never just let people bypass regulations by paying a high fee. Thus, you can't buy your way out of an environmental impact statement or heroin prohibition. And if the theory of market failure is right, this rigidity is deeply dysfunctional. 2. When markets produce too little of something, market failure theory tells governments to provide corrective subsidies that correspond to the severity of the shortfall, then let people do as they please. In the real world, in contrast, governments tend to directly run industries with alleged positive externalities. Public education and healthcare are the obvious example, but the same goes for national parks, government lands, etc. Furthermore, government firms routinely offer even rival products for gratis or next to gratis, even when the products have clear negative externalities, such as road congestion and subsidized energy. 3. While the theory of market failure abhors monopoly, actually existing governments do much to stifle competition. This is most grotesque for real estate and immigration, which most governments view with dire suspicion, but perhaps most blatant for occupational licensing. Again, if negative externalities were the real rationale for these restrictions, governments would just impose taxes, then let everyone build, move, and work as they please. I could go on, but general point is that market failure theory does more than complain about markets. It also tells governments how to repair them. Any government that fails to comply with these impressively precise instructions ipso facto fails. Indeed, non-compliant governments are a textbook case of government failure. And while the severity of this government failure varies, every known government fails severely. Contrary to poorly proofread textbooks, markets can yield social efficiency, even if these assumptions are violated. A polluting monopoly is the classic example, but there are endless others. Standard assumptions are a sufficient, not necessary, condition for social efficiency. January 14, 2019. Public choice, the normative core. The economic analysis of politics goes by many names: political economy, rational choice theory, formal political theory, social choice, economics of governance, endogenous policy theory, and public choice. Each of these labels picks out a subtly different intellectual tradition. Each tradition expands our understanding of the world. My favorite, though, remains public choice. As a GMU professor, you may attribute this to home team favoritism. Yet before I was a professor at GMU, I was a student at UC Berkeley and Princeton, and neither school fostered the love of public choice, to say the least. The main reason I prefer public choice, rather, is for its normative core. All economists who study politics do cost-benefit analysis, but the public choice approach is wiser and heretical. What exactly is this normative core of public choice? Simple. After doing standard microeconomic analysis of government policy, public choice adamantly states that's an upper bound on how well government intervention can work. In the real world, government intervention usually works much more poorly. Before we claim government intervention passes a cost-benefit test, we can, should, and must use past government performance to predict future government performance. The upshot: public choice economists end up opposing many government interventions blessed by textbook and policy wonk alike. Example: most economists, even economists who study politics, are fans of Pigovian taxation to address externalities problems. What public choice reminds us, though, is that Pigovian taxation is the best that governments can accomplish. In the real world, however, governments are worse in dozens of ways. Before you advocate a regime where government sets Pigovian taxes to address externalities, then you should estimate what real-world governments will actually do when you give them that kind of power. Another case. When I was a grad student TAing industrial organization, I often argued with the junior professor teaching the class. He knew a lot of theory, but almost no economic history, so I told him about quite a few famously anti-competitive antitrust decisions. After a while, I recall a little exchange that went roughly like this. Junior professor: Bryan, I don't care about what government did in the past, I care about what government is going to do in the future. Me: shouldn't we use the past behavior of government to predict the likely future behavior of government? Junior professor: by that standard, government should never do anything. Me: double take, not really, but okay. For junior professor, the normative core of public choice was practically a reductio ad absurdum, but that's only because he started with a firm pro-government conclusion and rejected even ironclad premises that undermined it. So when I applied the normative core of public choice, he saw a big bias against government. This so-called bias, however, is simply well-justified pessimism. If actual governments abuse the power to tax, subsidize, and regulate, then it makes cost-benefit sense to put the officials who set tax, subsidy, and regulatory policies in a few chains, or a lot of chains, or a solid block of concrete. Mainstream economists tend to scoff at this mentality. Frankly, that's because they're 50 years behind the research frontier. Although textbook demonstrations that well-crafted government policies can make the world better are fun homework problems, they end up being an intellectual smokescreen for demagoguery. The normative core of public choice shows that laissez-faire is undervalued, even when good government is plainly able to make things better. Past experience teaches us to be deeply skeptical that government will do so in practice. Until economists judgmentally study government in action, they have no business recommending that government do much of anything. September 15, 2020. Geography is policy. For the last 20 years or so, Jeffrey Sachs and co-authors have been arguing that institutions and policy matter less than most economists think. The harsh reality is that geography has a huge effect on countries' economic success. From what I've seen, the geography matters camp is onto something. Even after correcting for national ancestry, high absolute latitude and coastal access continue to have huge economic payoffs. In fact, geographic effects are much more robust than the effects of national ancestry. Social scientists who accept the power of geography tend to get pretty pessimistic about development. If poor countries adopted the institutions and policies of rich countries, they still wouldn't do very well. Few go full fatalist, but they do lose hope that economic reforms can quickly transform the world. And that's where the geocentric economists are completely wrong. Contrary to their own self-image, their view is radically optimistic. Consider the extreme scenario where geography is the sole determinant of national prosperity. Is there anything mankind could do to swiftly raise per capita GDP? Absolutely. Move people from poor countries to rich countries. Is that the kind of thing that policy can change? Again, absolutely. Legalize movement from poor countries to rich countries. How much would that accomplish? Given the draconian regulations now on the books, such deregulation would swiftly transform the world. In the real world, of course, geography isn't the sole global problem, so deregulating migration isn't a full-blown panacea for global ills. But if Sachs is remotely right, this deregulation is the closest thing to a panacea we've got. Bad geography only retards human progress insofar as humans remain in locations with bad geography, and once it's legal, humans will vacate the bad areas on a massive scale. To be fair, Jeff Sachs has written in favor of freer migration. When high-income, high-productivity countries close their national borders to migration, they are denying the rights of individual migrants to seek improvement in their own conditions, and are also blocking a vital channel for improved global productivity. A global migration regime should favor migration both on account of the global efficiency gains and on account of the human right of individuals to seek their preferred residences. See Cairns 2013 for a cogent ethical analysis from a human rights perspective. The global regime should pay special attention to emigration from the world's most impoverished regions, with special attention to those suffering from intrinsic barriers to development due to geographical, ecological, climatological, or other intrinsic factors. Migrants from such regions face the greatest need to emigrate but also the greatest obstacles. They tend to be poor, less educated, and with few familial or business contacts in high-income countries to facilitate their migration. These are the boat people drowning in the Mediterranean. But to the best of my knowledge, Sachs never quite makes the fundamental point. Migration policy is the cofactor that makes geography important. Geography matters a lot does not imply policy doesn't matter so much. Instead, it implies that migration policy matters a lot. Geography is not destiny, but opportunity. May 15, 2017. The behavioral econ of paperwork. Next month, I'll collect my final payment from my dependent care flexible spending account, and I couldn't be happier. I hate filling out paperwork. Though it only takes a couple hours to save thousands of dollars, I resent the process. I'm not alone. Education researchers, for example, find that many students leave free money sitting on the table because they fail to fill out the proper forms. Furthermore, modest help with form completion markedly raises uptake. Some highlights. Some students receiving college financial aid could be getting more. Others fail to qualify for aid entirely. Each year, more than 1 million college students in the United States who are eligible for grant aid fail to complete the necessary forms to receive it. Bird and Castleman, 2014, estimate that nearly 20% of annual Pell Grant recipients in good academic standing fail to refile a FAFSA after their freshman year, and subsequently miss out on financial aid for the following academic year. And, additionally, the complexity of the financial aid application confuses and deters students. ACS-FA 2001-2005. To determine eligibility, students and their families must fill out an 8-page, detailed application called the Free Application for Federal Student Aid, FAFSA, which has over 100 questions. King, 2004, estimates that 850,000 college students who were eligible for federal grant aid in 2000 did not complete the forms necessary to receive their benefits. Since I think education is extremely socially wasteful, I'm glad that so many students fail to game the system. But, as Robin Hanson pointed out at a seminar on this research, there's probably something much bigger at work. What researchers have learned about students in FAFSA is probably just a special case of the fact that humans hate filling out paperwork. As a result, objectively small paperwork costs plausibly have huge behavioral responses. Consider a few possible margins. 1. A small business owner decides not to hire a worker because he doesn't want to fill out tax and other regulatory compliance forms. 2. A homeowner decides not to improve his home because he doesn't want to get the necessary permits and inspections. 3. A traveler decides not to visit a country because he doesn't feel like applying for a visa. 4. An unemployed worker, note the low opportunity cost, doesn't apply for unemployment insurance because the process is aggravating. 5. A childless couple decides against adoption because the bureaucracy is hellish, or, in the case of international adoption, hellish squared. Many people's knee-jerk reaction will be, let's cut red tape, but the craftier response is, let's manipulate red tape. If X is good, we can noticeably encourage it by modestly simplifying the paperwork. So yes, cut red tape for employment, construction, travel, and adoption. If X is bad, though, we can noticeably discourage it by modestly complicating the paperwork. Indeed, complexity is a viable substitute for explicit means testing. If you lack the patience to fill out 10 forms, you probably don't really need the money. Of course, if someone fills out paperwork full-time, they might become inured to the drudgery. But we'd still expect oversized behavioral effects of paperwork for everyone who can't cheaply delegate such tasks to a trusted professional. May 23, 2017. State capacity is sleight of hand. Suppose I propose the following theory of economic development. The root cause of economic development is social capacity. Highly developed societies have immense social capacity, as evidenced by their countless achievements. Backward societies lack social capacity, as evidenced by their countless problems. You'd probably be unimpressed. At first glance, this is a circular theory that explains nothing. Why are things so good in X? Because X has great social capacity. How do we know X has great social capacity? Because things are so good in X. On closer consideration, though, the social capacity theory is not utterly empty. It makes one grand empirical prediction. Good social outcomes correlate. Income, wealth, happiness, health, culture, entertainment, leisure, and safety will all go together. And in point of fact, this prediction is true. Good social outcomes do tend to go together. Saying society X has good health because it has high social capacity is comparable to person A is good at learning math because he has a high IQ. In both cases, we legitimately use good general outcomes to predict good specific outcomes. Still, using social capacity to explain the world seems deeply unsatisfying for two main reasons. First, informed observers are already well aware that good outcomes correlate. A conceptual framework that predicts the standard findings is better than nothing, but it's hardly a triumph of the human intellect. Second, once you understand the concept of social capacity, you can immediately articulate an obvious critique. The question we really care about is not whether social capacity varies widely between countries, but why. Why bring this up? In recent years, many social scientists, including several of my colleagues, have fallen in love with the concept of state capacity. GMU economic historians Noel Johnson and Mark Koyama provide a nice overview in Explorations in Economic History. State capacity describes the ability of a state to collect taxes, enforce law and order, and provide public goods. State capacity can be thought of as comprising two components. First, a high-capacity state must be able to enforce its rules across the entirety of the territory it claims to rule, legal capacity. Second, it has to be able to garner enough tax revenues from the economy to implement its policies, fiscal capacity. State capacity, then, should be distinguished from either the size or the scope of the state. A state with a bloated and inefficient public sector may be comparatively ineffective at implementing policies and raising tax revenues. Furthermore, historians agree that the 18th century British state had high state capacity, even though it played a very limited role in the economy. Similarly, state capacity requires a degree of political and legal centralization, but it should not be identified with political centralization per se. The rulers of feudal society, in which many legal and fiscal choices were devolved to local lords, indeed had low state capacity. But the concentration of political authority in the center may cause inefficiencies and thereby undermine state capacity. This seems like a fine description of what state capacity researchers think they've discovered, but I reject Johnson and Koyama's approving tone. Read them closely. You can't measure state capacity by the size or scope of government. That's a no-no. If the public sector is bloated and inefficient, that's not high state capacity either. Concentration of political authority is causing inefficiencies. Well, you just undermined state capacity in the process of trying to increase it. To my mind, this is scarcely better than saying, good government is good, bad government is bad. Matters would be different, admittedly, if the state capacity literature showed that good government is the crucial ingredient required for success. But researchers rarely even try to show this. Instead, they look at various societies and say, look at how well-run the governments in successful countries are, and look at how poorly run the governments in unsuccessful countries are. The casual causal insinuation is palpable. More careful researchers, to be fair, make the extra effort to try to explain the origins of state capacity. Johnson and Koyama name state antiquity, culture, and civil society. But at this point, why not just ditch your premature focus on state capacity in favor of an open-minded exploration of social capacity? Good government might be the crucial ingredient for success. But maybe good government is a byproduct of wealth, trust, intelligence, freedom, or some cocktail thereof. Or maybe there's a complex feedback loop. We can readily verify that all these good things tend to go together. Untangling that tangled causal web of success, in contrast, is a labor of Hercules. If I'm right, why has state capacity become such a fashionable explanatory concept despite its pervasive conceptual weaknesses? Here's a short list of stories. 1. One simple theory of development gives overwhelming credit to government. But a theory this simple is open to devastating counterexamples. State capacity has the same psychological appeal without this empirical vulnerability. Why not? Because while we can observe states, we can only infer their, quote, capacity. Thus, anytime government leads to disaster, you can say, too bad they didn't have higher state capacity. Anytime government leads to good results, in contrast, you can say, hooray for state capacity. 2. State capacity sounds a lot less tautological than social capacity, even though the latter concept is much cleaner. State capacity causes social success sounds profound. Social capacity causes social success. Not so much. 3. State capacity splits the ideological difference between libertarians and statists, and thereby appeals to a broad academic spectrum. State sympathizers can emphasize the wonder of government. State skeptics can emphasize the danger of badly run government. 4. Don't forget sheer faddishness. Academia is full of it. I freely admit that the state capacity literature has much to teach us, but that's largely despite its conceptual framework, not because of it. Readers must constantly guard against intellectual sleight of hand that pervades this research. While good social outcomes all tend to go together, the state capacity literature fails to show that government is the crucial factor that makes all the others possible. Indeed, as far as I can tell, existing empirics are quite consistent with Sutton's law that people rob banks because that's where the money is. Perhaps rich societies have big governments because it takes a colossal host to sustain colossal parasitism. Think of San Francisco or New York City before you scoff. June 5, 2018. State priorities, not state capacity. In the last few years, social scientists have started heavily appealing to state capacity to explain the wealth of nations. Why do some countries prosper? Because they have great state capacity. Why do others flounder? Because they have crummy state capacity. What do floundering countries need to do in order to prosper? Build state capacity. Naturally. Many of these same social scientists see the coronavirus as a great vindication of their research. Which countries are coping well with coronavirus? The ones with great state capacity. Which countries have been devastated? The ones with crummy state capacity. How can we resolve our current crisis? Again, build state capacity. 2 years ago, I heavily criticized the state capacity fad. Weak and question-begging empirics aside, the whole literature is conceptually confused. But the current crisis has convinced me that I've been overly generous. How so? Because the coronavirus crisis plainly shows that Western democracies have overwhelming state capacity. Check out the muscles on these governments. They haven't just effortlessly raised and spent trillions of dollars. They handily shut down their entire non-essential economies. In a matter of weeks, they casually disemployed many tens of millions of workers, shuttered millions of businesses, and virtually sealed their borders to trade as well as travel. After this staggering exercise of power, I don't see how you can fairly attribute any shortcoming of these governments before the crisis on lack of state capacity. The sheer capacity of these states beggars belief. Why, then, do most of the Western democracies seem to be doing such an incompetent job? Perhaps most egregiously, the U.S. federal government spent over $2 trillion on relief, but next to nothing on testing or research. As Alex Tabarrok summarizes, we would also save medical costs by suppressing the virus. The focus on ventilators has perhaps been overdone, given that ventilators in no way guarantee survival. Better to stop people needing ventilators. We would also save lives. Thus, a program of mass testing seems like a no-brainer. Yet there is no direct funding for anything like this in the $2.2 trillion CARES bill, which is stunning. Here's Austin Goolsbee. We literally put in a tax break for retailers and restaurants to expand their capacity, but not money for production of more COVID tests. Here's Paul Romer. We have an economic crisis because it is not safe for people to work or consume. Our Congress just passed a bill that will spend $2.2 trillion to deal with the crisis. Can anyone identify any spending in this bill devoted to making it safe for people to work and consume? What's going wrong? Simple. Despite fantastic state capacity, the U.S. government has absurd state priorities. Instead of squandering trillions on poorly targeted relief, the U.S. government could have spent a few $100 billion on testing and vaccine research. Better yet, it could have offered hundreds of billions in prizes for progress in these areas, prizes open to anyone on Earth to win. So why didn't this happen? Simple. Because the people in charge in virtually every country are irresponsible, disorganized, innumerate, impulsive, and emotional. Blaming their failures on lack of state capacity is like blaming Bill Cosby's imprisonment on lack of financial capacity. Cosby's in jail because he's a serial rapist, not because he lacked the money to hire a good lawyer. When your resources are superabundant, the top remaining explanation for failure is your own terrible choices. My point. As a matter of logic, success and failure depend on two factors. Factor number 1, the total resources you possess, your capacity. Factor number 2, how you choose to use those resources, your priorities. Isn't this obvious? It is to me. But I don't think I've ever heard a fan of state capacity research acknowledge this obvious point, much less try to fairly adjudicate it. I don't think I've ever heard such a fan say, you could say that some governments fail than sufficient to handle their problems. But using our new measure of squandering, I don't think I've ever heard such a fan say, you could say that some governments would succeed if they simply revised their priorities. But using a new data set on priority revisions, I'm tempted to say that appeals to state capacity are tautological. But even the tautologies are half-baked. The underlying confusion. When a person doesn't do X, we often casually announce, he can't do X. That, my friend, is a total leap of logic. Yes, perhaps the person in question genuinely can't do X. On the other hand, maybe he's simply made X a low priority. The only way to really know is to see what happens when the person in question unambiguously makes his absolute priority. In slogan form, can't implies won't. Won't does not imply can't. The same goes for organizations, including governments. The Soviet Union failed to grow enough food to feed its people. That does not imply, however, that the Soviet Union lacked the capacity to do so. The real story, in fact, is that the Soviet government doggedly prioritized military might over civilian diet. So what? At a minimum, we need to audit the entire state capacity literature. To what extent can the problems it attributes to state capacity instead be assigned to state priorities? Unless we miraculously discover that capacity, not priorities, explains 100% of all sub-perfect government performance, the next step is to dial down the multitudinous simplistic pleas for increasing state capacity and replace them with pleas for better state priorities. Instead of pretending that the coronavirus crisis somehow confirms everything they've been claiming, this is a time for the fans of state capacity to engage in poignant soul-searching. Western democracies have decisively displayed their gargantuan capacity. But what good is gargantuan capacity in the hands of short-sighted, power-hungry demagogues? There's a great scene in Kill Bill where Vernita Green tells the bride, "That's being more rational than Bill led me to believe you were capable of." And the bride responds, "It's mercy, compassion, and forgiveness I lack, not rationality." Next time a researcher sees poor government performance and blames lack of state capacity, tell them, perhaps it's good priorities it lacks, not capacity. Then tell me how they respond, because I'd really like to know. Yes, a follow-up bill added $25 billion for research, but it's still an afterthought. April 29, 2020. A simple proof not all markets work well. 25 years ago, I interned at the Cato Institute and met Jerry Taylor. Now he runs the Niskanen Center. Here's what Jerry says about the movement we've both inhabited for decades. Libertarians love to preach the virtues of markets. Yet in the marketplace of ideas, their bundled product has been regularly and thoroughly rejected for over a century. Until libertarians acknowledge that market verdict and rethink either what they're selling, how they're selling it, or both, they will remain on the margins of American political life. Perhaps Jerry's only being poetic, but I see a deep truth within. However you cut it, all markets don't work well. Consider these three premises. 1. All markets work well. 2. If the market for ideas works well, truth will largely win out. 3. The market for ideas strongly rejects the view that all markets work well. It's easy, appropriate, to throw this argument in the face of the dogmatic libertarian. All markets work well? Then how come the market rejects your ideas? But the thoughtful libertarian should reject dogma in favor of some combination of the following. 1. Most markets work well, but the market for ideas doesn't. Why not? Because ideas have massive externalities. The market for pollution works poorly because strangers bear almost all the cost of your pollution. The market for ideas, similarly, works poorly because strangers bear almost all the cost of your irrationality. This is the heart of my argument in the myth of the rational voter. 2. Truth doesn't largely win out in a well-functioning market for ideas because consumers primarily seek not truth but comfort and entertainment. Look at the market for religion. No matter what your religious views, it's hard to claim truth prevails because even the generously defined market leader has less than half the market. The same goes for political ideas. Like Jerry, I reject dogmatic libertarianism, and I'm all for better marketing of libertarian ideas. But no matter how true libertarianism is, we shouldn't expect it to be popular. Why not? Because it tells people an ocean of things they deeply resent. Better marketing can soften the blow, but can't turn it into a pat on the head. While this is no excuse for having a bad attitude, few markets are more perverse than the market for ideas. Treating its verdict as a test of truth is a terrible mistake. February 9, 2016. Why do government enterprises work so well? When I was in high school, Murray Rothbard's analysis of government ownership was a revelation. Why was my high school a den of waste, incompetence, and stagnation? Because it was a government enterprise. On the free market, in short, the consumer is king, and any business firm that wants to make profits and avoid losses tries its best to serve the consumer as efficiently and at as low a cost as possible. In a government operation, in contrast, everything changes. Inherent in all government operation is a grave and fatal split between service and payment, between the providing of a service and the payment for receiving it. The government bureau does not get its income, as does the private firm, from serving the consumer well or from consumer purchases of its products exceeding its costs of operation. No, the government bureau acquires its income from mulcting the long-suffering taxpayer. Its operations, therefore, become inefficient and costs zoom, since government bureaus need not worry about losses or bankruptcy. They can make up their losses by additional extractions from the public till. Furthermore, the consumer, instead of being courted and wooed for his favor, becomes a mere annoyance to the government, someone who is wasting the government's scarce resources. In government operations, the consumer is treated like an unwelcome intruder, an interference in the quiet enjoyment by the bureaucrat of his steady income. 25 years and a PhD in economics later, Rothbard's words still sound like a revelation. They handily explain everything wrong in government enterprises. There's just one problem. Rothbard's words explain far too much. Since graduating high school, I've seen a lot more government enterprises. I've paid more attention to the ones I already knew. And I've worked in a government enterprise for 17 years. Their performance is almost always disappointing. But contrary to Rothbard's story, their performance is rarely disastrous. The U.S. Post Office almost always delivers my letters in 3 days or less. One hurricane aside, I always have clean tap water for pennies a gallon. And most public school teachers put on a smile every morning and try to share some knowledge with their students. What's going on? Consider the following stories. 1. Rothbard mischaracterizes government employees' incentives. Somewhat, but he's not far off. In the public sector, the connection between pay and performance is truly weak. Public universities, for example, are satisfied with professors, teaching as long as they demonstrate high competence. In plain English, that's the top 95% of the distribution, or even the top 98%. Universities hold research to higher standards, but one lame article a year in a refereed journal usually suffices for tenure. 2. Elected politicians compete to make government work. There's definitely something to this, but status quo bias is pervasive. Voters may throw politicians out if there's a sudden decline in the performance of government enterprises, but voters yawn in the face of eternal mediocrity. 3. Government employees take pride in their work. In many parts of government, workers would feel bad about themselves if they fully exploited the system. This is obvious for teachers, most of whom clearly like children. But even most mailmen seem to care about doing a decent job. 4. Government employees care about their coworkers' esteem. Government employees, like most human beings, don't want people around them to hold them in contempt. As a result, a solid core of motivated government employees can use peer pressure to squeeze effort out of their careerist coworkers. Some professors, for example, love teaching, and therefore look down on professors who teach poorly. Fear of this down-looking impels conformist professors to do a better job. Am I damning with faint praise? Sure, even the best government enterprises are slow to cut costs. They're bad at innovation. And they're almost uniformly terrible at putting aside social desirability bias to answer every enterprise's most fundamental question. Is this worth doing at all? 2. Yet the anomaly remains. Simple economics implies that government enterprises should be far worse than they really are. Unfortunately, I doubt the economics profession will ever take this anomaly seriously. Left-leaning economists don't want to grant the obvious case against government enterprise, and market-leaning economists would rather reiterate the obvious case against government enterprise than calmly test it against the facts. Update. Nathaniel Betchoffer points out I wrote a near-identical post 5 years ago. I had a slight suspicion that this was so, but my search missed it. The good news is that my thinking is consistent, all the way down to the order of explanations. August 29, 2014. Why not protect workers from customers? Most countries have a long list of worker protection laws. Laws protect workers against low pay, lack of benefits, discrimination, sexual harassment, overtime, normal pay, and much, much more. Basic labor economics teaches us to view these laws with skepticism. When you force employers to increase one kind of compensation, they can usually just cut another. And if perchance the law genuinely increases overall compensation, it would be amazing if employment didn't fall. Suppose, however, that worker protection laws function as intended, shielding workers from unfair treatment with zero negative side effects. A strange anomaly remains. Why does the law try so hard to protect workers from unfair treatment by employers, without making even token efforts to protect workers from unfair treatment by customers? If a restaurant manager makes unwanted advances on a waitress, the law gives her the right to sue. But if a dozen customers a day make unwanted advances on the same waitress, the law is basically silent. This lack of symmetry is even more puzzling when you consider the economics of repeated games. A manager interacts with each employee day after day. A mistreated employee can therefore informally retaliate against an unfair manager in countless ways. Indeed, fear of such retaliation is the chief explanation for ubiquitous nominal wage rigidity. Many customers, in contrast, never interact with the same employee twice, or at least interact with the same employee so rarely that amnesia sets in. As a result, customers can mistreat employees with impunity, scoffing at the karmic adage, "What comes around, goes around." This isn't just abstract theory. You can hear it with your own ears. Everywhere I go, I overhear employers treating workers with respect, and customers treating workers like dirt. Most customers, to be fair, are vaguely civil. But if 5% of your customers are rude, emotionally abusive, or worse, you probably have a bad day. And to repeat, the law does essentially nothing to help you. Yes, if the same diner sexually harasses the same waitress every day, she could complain to her boss. Under the logic of hostile work environment doctrine, she could threaten to sue the restaurant unless it bans the harassing customer. But this does nothing to help the waitress against the endless stream of one-off pickup artists who harass her daily. You could say that the law can't protect workers from customers, but that's not true. The law could treat every worker on customer complaint like a traffic accident. You must share your identity on request to allow the legal process to move forward. If a customer accused of sexual harassment flees the scene, the law could treat his dine and dash like a hit and run. A less Orwellian option is to require firms to accept only credit card payments, then identify customers using their card numbers. Now you could object that the market has already solved the problem. When workers have to interact with unpleasant customers, employers pay extra to attract and retain workers, services. Economists call this a compensating differential. All else equal, unpleasant jobs pay more. That's a major reason why garbage men are low-skilled yet well-paid. Whatever your view, though, it's hard to grasp the logic of the status quo. The economics of repeated games and first-hand observation both tell us that customers are more poorly behaved than employers. If you don't take compensating differentials seriously, the government is misdirecting its resources, attacking petty employer offenses while ignoring serious customer offenses. And if you do take compensating differentials seriously, the government is absurdly trusting the market to handle the serious problem of customer-on-worker unfairness, while loudly doing something about the petty problem of employer-on-worker unfairness. What gives? The real explanation, once again, is probably the popular double standard in favor of indirect coercion. When customers treat workers badly, legal remedies would be direct coercion. Most people would recoil. Noxious customers ought to mend their ways, but it would be brutal, unfair, and wrong for the law to impose good manners. When firms treat workers badly, legal remedies are mere indirect coercion. Most people effuse. Unfair businesses ought to mend their ways, and government has the right, nay, the duty, to make them do so. Since the law coerces businesses, which in turn discipline managers and other employees, no normal person bats an eye. You could object that businesses are people. When the business is a sole proprietorship, the claim is undeniable. But you won't get far with these truisms, because dehumanization of business people is a key tenet of our secular religion. October 15th, 2013. Why we should separate health and state. Government already plays such a large role in healthcare that it may be hard to understand what separation of health and state means. Let me be clear. In my ideal world, we wouldn't just abolish Obamacare. We'd abolish Medicare, Medicaid, regulation of health insurance, medical licensing, and the Food and Drug Administration, for starters. Unlike many opponents of the latest legislation, I'm not saying, keep your government hands off my Medicare. Needless to say, my position is unpopular. You might even think I'm a villain for holding it. So just to play into your fears, I'll begin by quoting Dr. Horrible's sing-along blog. In this scene, Penny is telling Dr. Horrible about her last date, never realizing that Dr. Horrible is secretly in love with her. Penny: but he turned out to be totally sweet. Sometimes people are layered like that. There's something totally different underneath than what's on the surface. Dr. Horrible: and sometimes there's a third, even deeper level, and that one is the same as the top surface one, like with pie. This scene perfectly captures what I'm going to tell you about healthcare. On the surface, a free market in healthcare seems like the best approach. When you look a little deeper, the free market approach seems naive and dangerous. When you look deeper still, however, the free market approach turns out to be the best after all. Why does a free market in healthcare look good on the surface? The same reason a free market in almost anything looks good on the surface. On the free market, firms strive to satisfy the customer and constantly look for new and improved ways of doing business. Why? The profit motive. Firms that make customers happy prosper, and firms that don't go out of business. In the health sector, however, most people, including economists, think that free market logic fails. The main complaints: high cost, healthcare is ridiculously expensive. Externalities, my health depends on your health, and vice versa. Moral hazard, health insurance encourages unhealthy lifestyles and risky behavior. Adverse selection, people with bad health are more likely to buy insurance, which raises rates, which makes healthy people even less likely to buy insurance. Consumer ignorance and irrationality, people don't know much about health, and it's costly to learn. Even worse, they make systematic mistakes and foolishly defy fantastic medical authorities. On closer look, however, it's the complaints that fail, not the market. Some are false or greatly exaggerated. Others blame the market for problems caused by regulation. Some are true, but preferable to the alternative, the problems with the problems. High cost. A mountain of regulation makes healthcare and health insurance a lot more expensive than they'd be on the free market. Examples: medical licensing greatly increases the cost of doctors, many of whom are overqualified for the work they actually do. Regulation makes it hard to sell catastrophic and other low-cost insurance policies. Externalities. This is largely bait and switch. Only a tiny fraction of modern healthcare treats contagious disease. Moral hazard. Insurance encourages unhealthy lifestyles and risky behavior if everyone pays the same rates. But in a free market, insurers would charge riskier customers higher rates. So why don't they? Because regulators often tie their hands in the interest of fairness. Adverse selection. The least healthy people buy the most insurance if everyone pays equal rates. But again, the free market solution is to charge riskier customers higher rates. Governments habitually create adverse selection problems by trying to equalize rates, banning pre-existing conditions clauses, and so on. Consumer ignorance and irrationality. If consumer ignorance were the problem, government could easily solve it with a good website. What about the deeper problems of systematic error and blind trust? They're both very real, but argue against government involvement. If you take any decent health econ class, you'll hear about a pile of research showing that we greatly overestimate the health benefits of medicine and put too much trust in medical authorities. The government's response: encourage us to use more medicine and remove financial incentives to second-guess the experts. Real smart. If you're paying attention, you might notice that I've suggested some economically sensible role for government. What's wrong with government programs to fight contagious disease, fund a health information website, or study the effectiveness of different treatments? My answer: when you give government an inch, it takes a mile. Government involvement in healthcare started with small measures like vaccinations. Now it's over 20% of the budget and rising fast. Government involvement in healthcare is too dangerous to allow in any form. We need to just pull the plug. But wouldn't that be unjust to the poor? Even if free market healthcare is a lot cheaper, there will still be some Americans who can't afford it. Many people think that a just society should proudly protect its weakest members, just like a family would. I could object that the society as a family analogy is oppressive, even totalitarian, but I'm happy to accept it for the sake of argument. Notice, within the family, you are only legally obligated to care for your minor children and your spouse. You are not legally obligated to take care of your siblings, your nephews and nieces, or even the parents who gave you life. Almost everyone agrees with this approach. So, If you don't think it's just to legally compel people to support the parents who gave them life, why in the world would it be just to legally compel people to support complete strangers? It gets worse. Exaggerated notions of how much we owe our countrymen are a major rationalization for treating foreigners unjustly. Billions of people around the world earn $1 or $2 a day. Haitians, for example, would be delighted to take a low-skilled job in the United States, even without health care. But a leading argument against letting immigrants come is that they're already, quote, bankrupting our healthcare system. We're so obsessed with helping relatively poor Americans that we're willing to deny absolutely poor foreigners the basic human right to sell their labor to willing U.S. buyers. That's evil enough to appall Dr. Horrible himself. March 24, 2010. The high price of doctors, a disease of regulation. What's driving the high price of doctors? Market inequality or government entry restrictions? 1. My co-blogger's debate reminds me of a random encounter with some striking evidence. The Digest of Education Statistics, Table 294. If you peruse this table, you'll discover that total number of new MDs per year has been virtually flat for 30 years. During this period, population increased over 30%. As a result, the new MD/population ratio has declined for decades. If you're not horrified, consider that the senior population, doctors, best customers, increased by over 50%. As a result, new MDs per senior fell by about a third over the last 3 decades. This is exactly what you'd expect when government imposes rigid numerical quotas in the face of sharply rising demand, a constant quantity regardless of market conditions. If you're still not convinced, know this. Over the last 30 years, new female MDs have sharply increased. How is this possible given the stagnant total? Because the number of new male MDs dropped like a rock. New male MDs per person are down by over 45%. In any normal labor market, massive female entry would have led to a large increase in total workers. But the market for new doctors is anything but normal. The rise in new female doctors has been almost perfectly offset by a matching fall in new male doctors. My point, of course, is not that women have stolen men's places in medical school. My point, rather, is that draconian government entry barriers are the only credible explanation of the facts. Why else would the number of male doctors have fallen so far relative to demand? Infinitely inelastic demand for medical services. A massive decline in the talent of male applicants to medical school? As our population ages, we have naturally seen a large increase in the demand for doctors. If the market for MDs worked normally, however, we would have fortuitously experienced a large offsetting supply shock, the rise of the female doctor. Regulation has deprived us of this godsend and deprived vast numbers of qualified men and women of the right to work in their preferred occupation. Thanks to government entry barriers, demand has gone up and supply is frozen in place. Consumers and taxpayers are paying a fortune for medical care. And the problem is only going to get worse. March 4, 2013. Adverse hazard, moral selection, whatever. As far as I can tell, economists are even more sympathetic to socialized medicine than laymen. The question that sticks in my mind is why? Economists are normally calm and analytical. When it comes to government provision of health care, though, they rely almost exclusively on a simplistic angry mantra: moral hazard and adverse selection. When another economist points out that A, government provision doesn't do anything about moral hazard, and B, selection in insurance markets is usually advantageous, not adverse, the dialogue usually, though not always, ends. All this suggests that economists' arguments in favor of socialized medicine are largely rationalizations of a policy that they favored long before they studied economics. Since most other economists favor the same policy, they can safely defend it with awfully sloppy economics. If I cornered the typical economist who defends socialized medicine, I suspect he'd say something like, "It's not economists' job to question political ends. Our job is to help people achieve their political ends as efficiently as possible. If people want socialized medicine, we have to help make it work as well as possible." To which I'd reply, you don't say that when you're criticizing rent control or protectionism or labor market regulation. You criticize political ends all the time. If they quibbled, I'd add, perhaps to be more precise, you recognize that most political ends are themselves debatable means to more fundamental political ends. So why not debate this one too? Okay, so why not? I once heard a health econ textbook author say, yes, universal coverage would have little effect on health. But if most people wanted universal balloon ownership, I'd try to figure out the cheapest way to give it to them. July 20th, 2009. Who loves Bastiat and who loves him not? Thanks to everyone who responded to my query about Bastiat's what is seen and what is not seen. For me, his essay is the pinnacle of economic profundity. You can call it obvious. But when I first started learning economics at the age of 17, none of Bastiat was obvious. I was an honors student at a well-regarded California high school. Yet as far as I can remember, I had never heard any argument against the minimum wage, Social Security, or the FDA in my entire life. Every teacher and book I ever encountered treated naive populism like the law of gravitation. Evil businesses aren't paying workers enough? Raise the minimum wage. Problem solved. The elderly are poor? Increase Social Security payments. Problem solved. Evil businesses are selling people bad drugs? Impose more government regulation. Problem solved. If you favor these programs, you can call these arguments straw men. But I assure you, these straw men were never presented by opponents of these policies. On the contrary, these straw men were invariably presented by people who favored these policies. How is that possible? Because during my first 17 years of life, I never encountered an opponent of any of these policies. You might assume I grew up in a weird Berkeley-esque leftist enclave, but bland Northridge, California hardly qualifies. What was going on? The best explanation is pretty simple. I only heard strawman arguments in favor of populist policies because virtually everyone finds these strawman arguments pleasantly convincing. Regardless of the merits of the minimum wage, Social Security, and the FDA, economic illiteracy is the reason for their popularity. If someone like Bastiat convinced people that the pleasantly convincing arguments are inane, proponents would have to fall back on arguments that are intellectually better yet rhetorically inferior. Take the minimum wage. Normal people like it because the government waves a magic wand and makes mean employers give helpless workers extra money, with zero blowback. So inane, yet so convincing to a psychologically normal human. An intellectually serious argument, in contrast, begins by conceding the theoretical possibility of a disemployment effect, then defends low estimates of labor demand elasticity. This is a huge improvement in intellectual substance, yet persuades only wonks. This is the real root of Bastiat's differential ideological appeal. Friends of the free market love him because Bastiat destroys the inane arguments that make the modern welfare state popular. Once you deprive the median voter of these inane arguments, friends of the modern welfare state have to resort to intellectually serious arguments to make their case. Alas, these arguments are utterly beyond the median voter's comprehension. Most college students can't even grasp them. So what are friends of the modern welfare state to do when confronted with Bastiat? They can't really argue with him. They know what he says is largely true. Yet if they make a big deal out of Bastiat, they risk destroying popular support for the policies they favor. Sure, they could run a big economic education campaign to explain, stop making terrible arguments for great policies. The intellectually serious arguments are as follows. Blah, blah, blah. But what's the point? It's far easier to trivialize Bastiat, to pretend that everyone, or everyone who counts, already knows what Bastiat's trying to teach. If you only discuss policy with your fellow wonks, this pretense might even convince you. My thesis, however uncharitable, is entirely consistent with friends of the welfare state being correct. Maybe trivializing Bastiat is the noble lie that has to be told to keep the welfare state alive. Maybe. But ponder this. Suppose I'm right that almost everyone initially supports populist policies for inane reasons. If some of these people grow up to be sophisticated intellectuals, what do you think they're going to do when they realize that the arguments that originally convinced them are just plain stupid? Are they going to dispassionately put aside the worldview that inspired them to become intellectuals in the first place, then calmly weigh the intellectually serious arguments for and against every feel-good policy on the books? Or are they going to act like defense attorneys, to use their powerful intellects to zealously defend the populist policies they've always loved? August 15, 2012. Austerity for liberty. Suppose that in 2005, Bush managed to privatize Social Security to a politically astonishing degree. Under the hypothetical legislation, 1. Workers are free to divert 100% of their future payroll tax into private accounts. 2. Workers are free to immediately ask for the present value of their future SS checks, as long as they put their money in reputable investments. Let's say that half the people in the SS system took full advantage of the new rules. Question: after the 2008 crash and subsequent fallout, how would the political system have responded? I'll bet it would have made TARP look small. Tens of millions of people would have lost half their assets and half their retirement income as a direct result of Bush's legislation. The government wouldn't have stood idly by. In all likelihood, it would have enacted a kilo-page relief measure to tortuously compensate some of the losers, randomly increase regulation on financial markets, and bribe 100 fence-sitting legislators. This scenario and others like it make me suspect that constructive free market reforms like Social Security privatization, school choice, Medicare vouchers, etc., are largely a waste of libertarians' political capital. They pose two great risks. 1. If anything goes wrong, the market will receive all the blame. The political backlash could easily lead to policies more statist than ever. 2. In practice, the government will never implement a transparent free market reform. Even an idea as simple as give people the freedom to invest their own payroll taxes in a private account will quickly morph into a kilopage congressional boondoggle. This further increases the chance that something will go wrong, and when it does, the market will take all the heat. Depressing? I have a better way. Instead of pushing for constructive free market reforms, libertarians should doggedly focus on austerity, opposing spending increases, and pushing spending cuts. Instead of trying to privatize Social Security, for example, libertarians should push for lower benefits, a higher retirement age, and means testing. Instead of pushing for school choice, libertarians should try to restrain/shrink education budgets and push user fees. If libertarians have any political success, this will automatically expand the role of the market. After all, the less government does for people, the more they will do for themselves. Dissatisfied with government provision, people will save more for their own retirement and spend more on private education. In the limit, once the flow of government money ceases, voluntary exchange is all that's left. Austerity has two major advantages over more constructive free market reforms. 1. If anything goes wrong, public opinion is less likely to blame the market. Government decided to spend less on X. How is that the market's fault? Logically, people could simply reframe their complaints. But psychologically, it's easier to point fingers at markets directly sanctioned by government action than markets indirectly prompted by government inaction. 2. Congress is also less likely to use austerity as an excuse for new kilo-page legislation. Officially expanding market options takes sweeteners. Mere budget cutting, not so much. To be fair, I understand why libertarians promote constructive free market reforms. They sound better and feel nicer. Rhetorically speaking, a person can promote SS privatization and still be pro-retiree, or promote school choice and still be pro-education. The person who pushes for cuts in retirement and school budgets effectively forfeits these rhetorical options. But if you actually want to promote liberty, austerity seems like the option most likely to deliver it. HT, partly inspired by a lunch with Stephen Tellis, September 13, 2010. Part 4. Cogent Freedom. The Stranger. What do you call a man you never met? A stranger. What are you morally forbidden to do to a stranger? You may not murder him. You may not attack him. You may not enslave him. Neither may you rob him. What are you morally required to do for a stranger? Not much. Even if he seems hungry and asks you for food, you're probably within your rights to refuse. If you've ever been in a large city, you've refused to help the homeless on more than one occasion. And even if you think you broke your moral obligation to give, your moral obligation wasn't strong enough to let the beggar justifiably mug you. Notice, these common-sense ethics regarding strangers, ethics that almost everyone admits, are unequivocally libertarian. Yes, you have an obligation to leave strangers alone, but charity is optional. One last question. What fraction of your fellow citizens have you actually met? Virtually zero. The vast majority of your countrymen are, in fact, utter strangers to you. When you tell your kid, don't take rides from strangers, you don't make an exception for anyone who happens to share your citizenship. Modern government and most of political philosophy is just a massive effort to pretend otherwise. The point of the pretense is twofold. First, to make unjustified demands on some stranger's behalf. You're going to help the American elderly, the American poor, and the American sick whether you like it or not. Second, to help us forget our basic obligation to leave all strangers alone. We've never met you before, but you still owe us. When libertarians say things like this, people ridicule them as cold and cruel. But they're just dodging the issue. Even staunch anti-libertarians would be baffled if a homeless man announced, "Give me my money," instead of asking, "Spare change?" After all, the beggar is a stranger. All the libertarian is pointing out is that your other fellow citizens are strangers too. You're not cold and cruel when you refuse to help. They're being pushy and totalitarian when they refuse to take no for an answer. This would be bad enough if modern governments focused on forcing rich strangers to give to poor strangers. But it's outrageous when the direction of coercion reverses. The most egregious example, of course, is restrictions on immigration. People in the third world are strangers, but we still have a moral obligation to leave them in peace. Instead, we pass draconian laws forbidding these strangers to work for other complete strangers. And for what? To fulfill our fantastical obligation to maintain the wages of fellow citizens we don't trust enough to give our kids a ride. January 24th, 2011. Tough luck. What if a poor person gets sick, doesn't have insurance, and can't get friends, family, or charity to pay for treatment? What if an elderly person gets defrauded out of his entire retirement, and the perpetrator vanishes into thin air? What if a child is starving on the street, and no one voluntarily feeds him? What if someone just can't find a job? If you're a libertarian, you face what-ifs like this all the time. The point, normally, is to make you say, "Tough luck," and look like a monster. What puzzles me, though, is why libertarians rarely ask analogous questions, like, what if Congress passes an unjust law, the president signs it, and the Supreme Court upholds it? What if the government conscripts you to fight in an unjust war, and you die a horrible death? What if a poor person drinks and gambles away his welfare check? What if the government denies you permission to legally work? What if the president decides your ethnicity is a national security risk and puts you in a concentration camp, and the Supreme Court declares his action constitutional? What if a person lives an extremely unhealthy lifestyle, so by the time they're retired, they're in constant pain no matter how generous their Medicare coverage is? What happens if a president lies to start a war, and voters don't particularly care? Once you start the what-if game, it's hard to stop. Name any political system. I can generate endless hypotheticals to aggravate its supporters. The right lesson to draw. Every political perspective eventually has to say, tough luck, when confronted with well-crafted what-ifs. There's nothing uniquely hard-hearted or cruel about libertarianism. Defenders of democracy, nationalism, liberalism, conservatism, the American Constitution, and social democracy all eventually sigh, "Life's not fair," or, "Well, what do you want me to do about it?" The obvious reply is that some of these hypotheticals are more realistic than others. But that puts the critics of libertarianism on extremely thin ice. None of my alternate what-ifs are fanciful. Several of them: lethal conscription, unhealthy lifestyles, denying foreigners the right to work, mendacious wars, have happened or continue to happen on a massive scale in the most democratic nations on earth. In contrast, we've never seen a rich, modern, libertarian society. For all we know, private charity in Libertopia would more than suffice to end absolute poverty. Stranger things have happened. Why the double standard? The root, I suspect, is status quo bias. Most people tolerate the unpleasant ramifications of the status quo because they're used to them. You might get conscripted and die a horrible death? Oh well, that's life. Most people won't tolerate the unpleasant ramifications of libertarianism because they're used to a world where government says, "We'll never let that happen." But what's so great about that assurance, when it's bundled with a long list of other evils that governments blithely tolerate or actively commit on a grand scale every day? October 1st, 2012. The mosquito bite analogy. Free market economists often lament the difficulty of communicating their ideas to a popular audience. Why? Because the free market prescription is often, government should leave the problem alone. Trying to fix it only makes it worse. How is anyone supposed to sell such counterintuitive ideas? I think I've got a way to make the counterintuitive intuitive. Just say, many social problems are like mosquito bites. When a child gets a mosquito bite, every adult gives him the same advice. Don't scratch it. Touching the bite only makes it worse. The child's standard response, but it itches. The adult rebuttal, sure it itches, but now that you've got a mosquito bite, this itching is the best outcome you can hope for. Don't blame me, I'm only a messenger. This mosquito bite analogy doesn't just make the case for do-nothing solutions easy to understand. The analogy also instantly answers the, if your ideas are so great, why are they so unpopular? Objection. No one seriously denies that scratching mosquito bites makes them worse, but almost all children, and most adults, keep scratching. Why? Because, as Bastiat would say, good is apparent to the outer eye, while the harm reveals itself only to the inner eye of the mind. To keep your hands off your bites, you must constantly remind yourself that your impulses are folly. No small task. The rarity of do-nothing policies is no more puzzling than the rarity of keeping your hands off your mosquito bites. To be sure, there is one fundamental difference between mosquito bites and social ills. People have a strong incentive to control their urge to scratch, but no incentive at all to control their urge to vote for whatever superficially sounds good. After all, if an individual focuses on the long-run costs of scratching bites, he personally captures the benefit. If, in contrast, an individual focuses on the long-run costs of government solutions, nothing changes. That's democracy for you. For all his brilliance, Bastiat suffered under the same short-sighted policies as every other citizen of France. The mosquito bite analogy has two big lessons, one hopeful, one depressing. The hopeful lesson, there is a better way. Counterproductive solutions are all too real. Adults scratch their bites, and citizens vote to make bad situations worse. The depressing lesson, the better way is unlikely to be adopted. Many adults keep scratching their bites, even though they personally bear the costs. What are the odds that adults will stop voting to make bad situations worse when they can make all the mistakes they want, free of charge? HT, my dear son Simon, whose legs are covered with well-scratched mosquito bites despite my advice. Well, at least he has the good sense to welcome mosquito repellent. July 9th, 2013. The Libertarian Penumbra. Libertarians are famous for their internal disagreements, but they have far more beliefs in common than their core position requires. For starters, even non-consequentialist libertarians generally believe that libertarian policies have good consequences. Almost all libertarians think that free markets are better for economic growth, legalization of drugs would not radically increase drug use, and rent control causes shortages. The more interesting fact, though, is that libertarians have many beliefs in common that have little to do with the consequences of liberty. They're just part of our vibrant, iconoclastic intellectual subculture. A few examples. Most libertarians accept the validity of IQ testing. A perfectly good libertarian could reject IQ tests as culturally biased, but few do. Libertarians have favorable views of homeschooling, even though conventional private schooling is equally consistent with libertarian principles. Libertarianism implies opposition to government population control, but it doesn't imply another view common among libertarians, that population growth has major economic benefits because people are the ultimate resource. Notice, a statist who took this idea seriously could easily argue for government intervention to raise the birth rate. What are your favorite examples of other beliefs in this libertarian penumbra? Which are you willing to defend? Which are most subject to abuse? Are there any that make you cringe? Inquiring minds want to know. February 21st, 2011. The stages of libertarian denial. Libertarians set themselves apart from other political thinkers by habitually denying that government should do things. Denial is therefore at the heart of libertarian gone thought. Thanks to pop psychology, unfortunately, denial has come to mean refusing to admit the truth rather than refusing to admit what others claim. But denial is still a concept worth holding on to. Once you appreciate the role of denial in libertarianism, you're ready to categorize it. Playing off of pop psychology, I find it most useful to think about 6 stages of libertarian denial. Stage 1. Deny the problem exists. X. When someone complains about Chinese imports, the Libertarian says, "What's the problem? They're selling us cheap stuff." Stage 2. Blame the problem on the government. X. Sure, third world poverty is terrible, but without their governments, statist economic policies, and our immigration restrictions, they'd already be rich. Stage 3. Admit that the government didn't cause the problem, but insist that government action would only make the problem worse. X. Opposing price controls for grain after a severe drought. The market is making the best out of a terrible situation. You are going to destroy the incentives that will get us out of this disaster. Stage 4. Concede that government action wouldn't make the problem worse, but say that the cure is so expensive that we're better off just living with the problem. X. Opposing handicap accessibility regulations. It's going to cost 1% of GDP. For that price, we could give every handicapped person 3 full-time helpers. Stage 5. Admit that government action could solve a problem at a low cost, but claim that the libertarian principle is more important. X. Freedom means tolerating the very views that you find most abhorrent, even Satanism. Stage 6. Yield on libertarian principle, but try to minimize the deviation. X. Yes, government has to supply some roads, but we can still fund them with user fees, not taxes. I suspect that what sets me apart from the typical libertarian is that I lean especially heavily on stage 1. On discrimination, for example, I think that A. Taste-based discrimination is almost entirely eliminated by market forces, and that B. Statistical discrimination is at worst a venial sin. How would you position other libertarian thinkers on the stages of libertarian denial? Yourself? November 28, 2010. Worst advice to libertarians ever? I'm not sure if Tyler Cowen's advice to libertarians is the worst any serious thinker has ever given us, but it's up there. I'd like to give my dear friend and benefactor a charitable reading, but I just can't. Stripped of its rhetorical grace, Tyler's essay basically makes 2 big points. 1. We're really rich, so libertarians should quit trying to roll back the New Deal, even though we're basically right. We should embrace a world with growing wealth, growing positive liberty, and yes, growing government. We don't have to favor the growth in government per se, but we do need to recognize that sometimes it is a package deal. Let's not obsess over all the interventions represented by the New Deal, even though I would agree that most of those policies were bad ideas. It's hard to make any sense of this argument. If Tyler was trying to help libertarians overcome psychological depression by saying, sure, we live under statism, but cheer up, you're rich, he'd have a point. But sure, the New Deal was a bad idea, but quit fighting it. You're rich makes no sense. In fact, the richer you personally are, the more spare resources you have to argue against bad ideas. But what about Tyler's argument that prosperity and growth of government are a quote-unquote package deal? Again, it's hard to make sense of this. There's got to be more to being a quote-keyed deal than the fact that 2 things both happened. Here's the closest Tyler comes to arguments that prosperity and more government are a quote key, quote a quote key, quote g quote key, quote a quote e quote a quote key quote a quote a quote. The more wealth we have, the more government we can afford. Furthermore, the better government operates, the more government people will demand. The first argument is trivial. With statist preferences, more wealth brings more government. How is that a reason to quit arguing against statist preferences? You could just as easily tell an atheist that more wealth brings more religion, and he'd naturally respond. It wouldn't if people knew the truth, and I aim to tell them. The second argument builds on the strange assumption that libertarians have made government work better in any sense other than making it do less. Maybe Gore's Good Government panel made government work better. But, as Tyler has previously complained, libertarians barely acknowledge variation in the quality of governance. 2. Libertarians should jump on the scaremongering bandwagon and start worrying about global warming, epidemics, and nuclear proliferation, not to mention asteroids. But contrary to Tyler's suggestion, libertarians have been thinking about scary predictions for a long time. Remember Julian Simon. 4. Long story short. A. Scary stories are usually greatly exaggerated. B. Government corrections are quite likely to make problems worse. C. Liberty will suffer in the bargain. The war on terror, inspired by the 9/11 attacks, provides a nice confirmation of these deep lessons. The bottom line is that libertarians need to pay attention to these issues because non-libertarians are eager to do something about them. But libertarians' skeptical presumption against both the likelihood of disaster and the likelihood that government will avert disaster is wise and justified. Journalists, John Stossel accepted, should be learning from us, not the other way around. The underlying theme of Tyler's essay is that times have changed and libertarians need to change with them. As he puts it, America in the mid to late 1970s was a wreck, and libertarians indeed had a lot of the right answers. But frankly, I see no reason why Tyler couldn't have written virtually the same essay in 1975. By historical standards, we were really rich then too. Gas queues and 10% inflation were hardly the end of the world. Furthermore, in 1975, we also faced an array of threatening menaces. At least one, the Soviet threat, looked far worse than anything we live with today. If Tyler is right, that libertarians had a lot of the right answers in the 70s, then we still do today. March 14, 2007. Innocent bystanders. The world is full of problems, and most people want government to solve these problems. When government solves problems, however, they usually create some new ones. If you're lucky, the victims of the new problems are the very bad guys who created the original problems. Serves them right. Yet more often, the victims of the new problems are innocent bystanders. They've done nothing wrong. They're just caught in the crossfire. Like who? Let's start with babies in Nazi Germany. The babies didn't start the war. They've never hurt a fly. But it's hard to kill the Nazis without putting the babies. Lives in grave danger. You don't have to be a pacifist to realize that this is a tragic situation. Imagine trying to justify it to the babies. You're totally innocent, I get that. But Nazism is so horrible that I'm going to put your lives in grave danger anyway. I'm so sorry. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. This is an intellectually honest position, but oh so bitter. It's far sweeter to invoke collective guilt, say, they had it coming, and kill indiscriminately. You might reply, well, the intellectually honest position is demotivating. But that's not quite true. Yes, acknowledging innocent bystanders demotivates indiscriminate killing, but it strongly motivates the search for an approach with lower collateral damage. Given humans' ubiquitous in-group bias, this is a feature, not a bug. Wartime naturally highlights the most gruesome abuse of innocent bystanders. But many peacetime policies have the same structure. Take gun control. Suppose strict gun control would eliminate all mass shootings. Who could oppose such a policy? Most obviously, the vast majority of gun owners who never have and never will murder anyone. Gun control supporters will naturally be tempted to demonize them. The intellectually honest thing to say, however, is 99.99% of you gun owners are perfectly innocent. I get that. But mass shootings are so horrible, then I'm still going to take your guns away. I'm so sorry. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Demotivating? Well, it demotivates the promotion of strict gun control, but motivates the search for ways to reduce violence with lower collateral damage. Or take refugee policy. Suppose banning all refugees would eliminate all terrorism. Who could oppose such a policy? Most obviously, the vast majority of refugees who are not and never have been terrorists. Opponents of asylum will naturally be tempted to demonize them. Remember refugees? The intellectually honest thing to say, however, is 99.9999% of you refugees are totally innocent. I get that. But terrorism is so horrible that I'm going to refuse asylum anyway. I'm so sorry. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Intellectually honest? Check. Demotivating? Well, it demotivates indiscriminate rejection of refugees, but motivates the search for anti-terrorism tactics with lower collateral damage. War, gun control, and refugees. I deliberately chose 3 radically different illustrations. I suspect that readers will angrily object to at least one of them, but I really don't see how. Denying the existence of innocent bystanders is convenient. If they don't exist, we don't have to fret about them. Denying the existence of innocent bystanders is also pleasurable. What fun it is to unequivocally unleash your full arsenal against the forces of evil. Yet denying the existence of innocent bystanders is, above all, blind. Innocent bystanders exist. They have rights. You should think long and hard before violating them. And if you find no alternative, at least have the decency to tell them, I'm so sorry. January 31st, 2019. Demography and Decency. The staunchest critics of immigration focus on demographic complaints. We're currently a white/Christian/English-speaking/high IQ country. To maintain these favorable demographics, we have to heavily restrict or exclude contrary immigration. Keep out non-whites. Keep out non-Christians. Keep out non-Anglophones. Keep out people with low IQ. Mainstream defenders of immigration usually meet these demographic complaints by A, ignoring them, or B, playing the racism card. Truth be told, I think the racism card usually fits, but there's a much better response. Unlike most complaints about immigration, demographic ills can clearly be remedied with more immigration. Non-white immigration is messing up America? Then let in enough white immigrants to keep the white share constant. Non-Christian immigration is destroying our religious heritage? Then let in enough Christians to keep the Christian share constant. Non-Anglophones are turning English into a minority language? Then let in enough English speakers to balance them out. Low IQ immigration is making us dumb? Then let in enough high IQ immigrants to keep us smart. This is certainly a viable solution given current levels of immigration. The world has hundreds of millions of whites, Christians, English speakers, and IQs greater than 100. At least tens of millions of each group would love to permanently move to the U.S. Why haven't they? Because it's illegal, of course. If the U.S. selectively opened its borders to these groups, it could reverse decades of demographic change in a matter of years. In fact, the U.S. could admit vastly more third-world immigrants without changing overall demographics a bit, as long as it concurrently welcomed first-world immigrants to balance them. So why not? Most people, perhaps even including some supporters of open borders, will recoil at the thought of pandering to racism. But this puts symbolism over substance. If white and non-white foreigners should be free to move here, opening the doors to white foreigners is a big step in the right direction. Furthermore, nullifying demographic objections to immigration helps keep the door to other kinds of immigration open. But what about the people who fear demographic change? I could be wrong, but I suspect they too will recoil at my proposal. Sure, admitting tons of the people they like cures whatever demographic ills they lament, but it raises the status of immigration in general and fails to put resented outgroups in their place. In other words, they too put symbolism over substance. People who oppose immigration for demographic reasons will probably object that they're just pursuing the path of least resistance. Cutting the quota for undesirable immigrants is a lot easier than raising the quota for desirable immigrants. But they're wrong. This is a classic Nixon goes to China situation. If die-hard critics of immigration fervently urge, let's let in more immigrants from Europe, who will gainsay them? Sure, you could decry the supporters of European immigration as racists, but the accused suddenly have a great defense. How so? We support just as much non-white immigration as you do. Imagine if Mark Krikorian, head of the Center for Immigration Studies, had eagerly lobbied to admit all Christian victims of ISIS, instead of predictably looking for an excuse to exclude them. Even Krikorian says we should let them in is far more convincing than, once again, Krikorian says we should keep them out. Balancing allegedly bad immigration with good immigration is a keyhole solution. It takes anti-immigration arguments at face value, then tries to address them as cheaply and humanely as possible. If demographic shifts frighten you, there is no need to abandon common decency, to lash out at desperate foreigners searching for a better life. Just welcome the immigration we're getting, plus all the extra immigrants required. Keep our demographics steady. There is a prominent lobby for high-skilled immigration, which covertly amounts to lobbying for high IQ immigration. But prominent proponents of high-skilled immigration almost always rhetorically focus on labor and fiscal effects, not demographics. December 15th, 2015. The sweet spot of freedom. No one needs a political philosophy to tell them how to treat people they personally know. Once human beings forge personal bonds, they understand what to expect from each other. The main point of political philosophy is to tell people how to treat strangers. In practice, unfortunately, the way we treat strangers has more to do with our personal feelings about strangers than abstract philosophy. Or, to be more precise, the political philosophies we're willing to entertain heavily depend on our default emotions about people we've never met. Which leads to a libertarian question. Which of these default emotions are most consistent with a free society? Obviously, default emotions like hatred and disgust bode poorly for a free society. If you hate strangers, you're likely to favor government action to make them suffer. But default emotions like love and devotion are also inimical to human freedom. If you love every stranger like your own child, the idea of respecting their freedom to make their own mistakes is hard to stomach. You'll want to give strangers what they need, regardless of what they want. This yearning makes both paternalism and the welfare state quite enticing. If neither hate nor love cohere well with a free society, what does? Indifference sounds promising. Imagine trying to sell government persecution or government salvation to a society where the predominant emotion toward strangers is, meh, that's got nothing to do with me. But sheer indifference is not ideal. Free societies generate obvious benefits for your fellow man: prosperity, peace, and choice. So you'd expect someone who viewed strangers with moderate benevolence to support a free society more enthusiastically than someone who lacked these feelings. What then is the sweet spot of freedom? Moderate benevolence. A friendly cosmopolitan tolerance is my tentative answer. If you seek a free society, you should want people to smile upon mankind. But that's about it. Stronger feelings, including heartfelt love, turn human beings into demanding busybodies. And if demanding busybodies predominate in a free society, it won't remain free for long. August 26, 2014. A freedom to disown. Once your children come of age, you are free to disown them. A parent can financially and emotionally cut off his own children with legal impunity. The children have the same right, but since the parents are usually richer and die sooner, children are largely limited to cutting the emotional cord. People are just as free to disown more distant relatives, friends, and romantic partners. Disownment is a powerful threat to hang over others' heads. The stereotypical case is a wealthy parent saying, "You'll do what I say, or I'll cut you off without a dime." But the flip side, a greatless child vowing, "I'll never talk to you again unless you do this for me," is also common. When you're on the receiving end of such threats, it certainly feels coercive. This is especially true when others take the disowner's side against you, because you're out of step with prevailing mores. Almost everyone thinks that it's wrong to disown lightly. This norm is strongest for parents and children. The idea of cutting off one's adult children or parents without mighty cause horrifies most of us. Most people would probably go further and say that disowning others, or just threatening to do so, is wrong even if you have a pretty good reason. If you know for a fact that your son shouldn't marry his girlfriend, you still probably shouldn't threaten, "I'll disown you unless you break off the engagement." Actually, carrying out such a threat would be even worse. Despite everything I've said, though, almost everyone also has one very libertarian intuition on this subject. Namely, people have a right to disown. Passing a law saying, "You have to stay in touch with your parents," or "you can't disinherit your kids," just seems tyrannical. And the reason isn't that such laws would be hard to enforce. What could be easier than regulating bequests or giving grandparents the right to sue their kids for visitation with their grandkids? The reason, rather, is that disowning is not coercive in a morally relevant sense. Why not? Because the disownee can't justly claim to own the esteem or riches of the disowner, even if the disownee's life will be very hard without that esteem and riches. What do we learn from this? Most obviously, this is yet another piece of evidence that common-sense morality is extremely libertarian. A deeper lesson, though, is that libertarians are too quick to condemn traditional societies as, quote. All were to some degree, of course, just as all actual non-traditional societies are coercive to some degree. But how important was legal pressure relative to the threat to disown? In my judgment, the threat to disown was usually more important, which in turn requires libertarians to at least tone down their condemnation. Just to jog your intuitions, consider the show Downton Abbey, set in England in the 1910s and 1920s. Aristocratic daughter Sybil shocks her wealthy parents by deciding to marry her chauffeur. Sybil's father, Lord Grantham, keeps telling her that he won't allow the marriage. Sybil could have easily played the victim, dumped the chauffeur, and whined about coercion, but she doesn't. She knows that she's legally free to marry any man she wants, and that her family is legally free to utterly disown her. So Sybil tells her father that she's willing to give up the family's approval and money, and marries her chauffeur. Is Sybil's choice an easy one? Of course not. But her merely legal right to marry whoever she wants still has great moral significance. It means that neither she nor anyone else in her position can reasonably claim to be a slave. It also means if the law were to tilt the scales further in Sybil's favor, it wouldn't be preventing coercion, but inflicting it. May 23, 2012. Association, exclusion, liberty, and the status quo. One of my conservative friends keeps telling me that the right to associate is the right to exclude. As a libertarian, I agree. But the subtext of his slogan is that libertarians focus far too much on government regulations that abridge the freedom of association, and far too little on government regulations that abridge the freedom of exclusion. His claim, in fact, is that the only feasible way to protect the freedom to exclude is to restrict the freedom to associate. Since discrimination laws make it impossible for voluntary contracts to keep foreigners out of a neighborhood, for example, it's okay for immigration laws to keep foreigners out of the country entirely. All this suggests one big question. To what extent do existing policies that restrict freedom of association and exclusion actually bind? In other words, how different would the modern U.S. look if people were free to live, work, and play anywhere, if and only if the property owner consented? Let's start with exclusion. Many existing laws restrict the right to refuse to hire workers and serve customers. In real estate, restrictive covenants and homeowners associations are common, but if you try to use them for racial exclusion, courts won't enforce them. Single-gender clubs also occasionally face lawsuits. I'm against all of these limitations on the right to exclude, but how much do they actually change behavior in the modern U.S.? Only slightly, for a long list of reasons. 1. The law focuses on business. In dating, marriage, friendship, etc., the law doesn't even pretend to try to restrict the freedom to exclude. 2. As Standard Economics of Discrimination explains, people who run businesses face intense selection pressure to see only one color, green. Business people are usually too greedy to want to exercise their freedom to turn away qualified applicants or paying customers. Unless, of course, workers or customers are willing to pay a premium for segregation. 3. In the modern U.S., however, there's little demand for segregation. In fact, demand for segregation is usually negative. Most American customers would be uncomfortable patronizing a store that turned away blacks or gays. Existing laws might prevent a small niche market for segregated stores, but that's about it. 4. Under existing laws, there are still plenty of ways for businesses and other groups to keep out the riffraff. Charging high prices is the most obvious, as a fancy mall advertised on The Simpsons. Our prices discriminate because we can't. Restaurants can impose dress codes. Employers can require educational credentials. Homeowners, associations can tell everyone how to cut their lawn. Cult compounds can require all inhabitants to blindly obey the guru, etc. In the real world, mildly clever entrepreneurs can still supply workers and customers with almost all the exclusion they're willing to pay for. I don't deny that laws against exclusion occasionally have important effects, but their main effect in the modern U.S. economy isn't to reduce exclusion, but to pressure businesses to either overpay or avoid hiring workers who can easily sue for discrimination. Now consider regulations on the freedom of association. Many are marginal too. Not much would change if you legalized gay marriage or polygamy. They're just niche markets. But one class of regulations has a massive effect: immigration laws. Indeed, they probably have a bigger effect than all other regulations combined. It's simple. Billions of people around the world live on a few dollars a day or less. Under open borders, tens of millions of them would migrate to the U.S. every year. Remember, even if you're an illiterate peasant from Bangladesh, credit markets and/or employers would be happy to front the money for airfare. This immigration flow wouldn't stabilize until real estate prices massively increased and low-skilled wages drastically declined. The U.S. population could easily increase by 50% in a decade. New cities would blanket the country. The level of output would skyrocket, and its composition would rapidly change too. Whether you love this vision or hate it, you can't deny that free association would radically and rapidly reshape the face of America. I'm as supportive of the right to exclude as anyone, but current restrictions on this right are pretty minor. There are plenty of ways for markets to engineer exclusion, and there's not much demand for greater stringency. In contrast, restrictions on the right to associate are massive, and there is enormous pent-up demand to migrate. Hundreds of millions of people want to move here, landlords want to rent to them, employers want to hire them, but the law won't allow it. Contrary to my conservative friend, then, libertarians aren't the ones with a blind spot. He is. While restrictions on exclusion are occasionally irksome, they rarely ruin lives. Immigration laws, in contrast, usually condemn their victims to life, and often early death, in the Third World. Libertarians rightly emphasize the freedom to associate, because the status quo's restrictions on exclusion are minor and mild, and the status quo's restrictions on association are massive and monstrous. Binding arbitration, the radical implications. Contracts often require signatories to submit to binding arbitration. If a dispute arises, the parties don't go to court, they go to a private arbitrator. This arbitrator, in turn, makes a definitive ruling neither party can refuse. The whole point of binding arbitration is to bar parties from playing heads I win, tails I break even. If the arbitrator rules against you, you can't appeal the decision to a conventional government court. Binding arbitration has thrived in recent decades. But on reflection, fully binding arbitration would nullify a vast swath of regulation. Every government effort to shift the terms of trade would be in grave danger. Imagine, for example, an employment contract specifying that alleged minimum wage violations will be resolved via binding arbitration. Any employer who wanted to offer less than the minimum wage could contractually specify an arbitrator who invariably rules in his favor. And any worker ready to work for less than the minimum wage would willingly sign. After all, what's the difference between the absence of a minimum wage and a minimum wage that's never enforced? The same principle applies to all regulation of capitalist acts between consenting adults, safety regulations, discrimination laws, product liability, and so on. Want to work for me? Fine, as long as my brother adjudicates all our disputes. Parties who can contractually outsource enforcement to anyone they like can informally gut the law. So why hasn't this already happened? Transactions costs are part of the reason. Getting every trading partner to sign a contract is a pain in the neck. But the fundamental reason is that governments refuse to recognize fully binding arbitration, probably because its officials recognize, at least subconsciously, that fully binding arbitration would strip them of much of their power. The Free Legal Dictionary explains. The FAA gives only 4 grounds on which a court may vacate or overturn an award. 1, where the award is the result of corruption, fraud, or undue means. 2, where the arbitrators were evidently partial or corrupt. 3, where the arbitrators were guilty of misconduct in refusing to postpone the hearing or hear pertinent evidence, or where their misbehavior prejudiced the rights of any party. And 4, where the arbitrators exceeded their powers or imperfectly executed them so that a mutual, final, and definite award was not made. In the 1953 case, Wilco v. Swan, the U.S. Supreme Court suggested, in passing, that an award may be set aside if it is in manifest disregard of the law, and federal courts have sometimes followed this principle. Public policy can also be grounds for vacating, but this recourse is severely limited to well-defined policy based on legal precedent, a rule emphasized by the Supreme Court in the 1987 case United. Paperworkers International Union v. Misco. The legal dictionary's tone suggests that these are but mild impediments, but they're huge. If the government can overrule binding arbitration because the arbitrators are partial or manifestly disregard the law, arbitration's radical potential stays hidden. Long ago, I interviewed the CEO of an arbitration firm. When I asked him about the radical implications of binding arbitration, he got nervous. His words were libertarian: if you don't like the arbitration contract, don't sign. But he clearly wanted to change the subject. One of his key services was helping clients skirt the law, and the best way to continue providing such services was to pretend they didn't exist. I suppose I could have thanked him for mitigating the harm of a multitude of unjust and inefficient laws, but I think that just would have spooked him further. September 26, 2016. The Pigovian Minarchist. Many minarchists, most notably Ayn Rand, believe their minimal state should be funded by voluntary taxation. As Rand puts it, in a fully free society, taxation, or to be exact, payment for governmental services, would be voluntary. Since the proper services of a government, the police, the armed forces, the law courts, are demonstrably needed by individual citizens and affect their interests directly, the citizens would, and should, be willing to pay for such services as they pay for insurance. The rationale. The principle of voluntary government financing rests on the following premises: that the government is not the owner of the citizens' income and therefore cannot hold a blank check on that income, that the nature of the proper government services must be constitutionally defined and delimited, leaving the government no power to enlarge the scope of its services at its own arbitrary discretion. Consequently, the principle of voluntary government financing regards the government as the servant, not the ruler, of the citizens, as an agent who must be paid for his services, not as a benefactor whose services are gratuitous, who dispenses something for nothing. Economically, there's an obvious objection to this version of voluntary taxation. Namely, 1. If the government sells excludable goods, the free market will almost always offer a better deal. 2. If the government sells non-excludable goods, people have no incentive to pay. But there's also a persuasive rights-based objection to the general idea of voluntary taxation. Namely, 1. Individuals shouldn't have to pay the government in order to use what they own. 2. Individuals shouldn't be allowed to pay the government in order to use what others own. Intuitively, if X doesn't violate rights, it should be legal. If X does violate rights, it should be illegal. Either way, a government in search of revenue is out of luck. Or is it? Even the staunchest libertarian has to admit that rights violations are occasionally fuzzy. The smoke from a small campfire violates no one's rights, but the smoke from a mile-wide campfire usually will. Dropping an ounce of toxic waste in the ocean violates no one's rights, but dumping 1 billion tons of toxic waste in the ocean does. All this implies a golden opportunity for the scrupulous minarchist. While the government has no right to totally ban fires or toxic waste, it has a responsibility to prevent people's rights from being violated by either. Sure, it could discharge this responsibility with an outright ban on excessive emissions. But there's another approach. Impose a Pigovian tax on excessive emissions, and keep raising the tax until emissions are no longer excessive. This proverbially kills 2 birds with 1 stone, protecting rights and raising the revenue required to protect those rights. What about the rights of the polluter? As long as the government only taxes emissions severe enough to constitute a rights violation, the polluter has no legitimate complaint. The government is merely deterring him from doing what he has no right to do in the first place. What about the rights of the pollutees? As long as the government taxes emissions down to a level mild enough to not constitute a rights violation, the pollutee has no legitimate complaint either. The government is merely allowing people to exercise their rights to light a little campfire. Note further that Pigovian taxes give government a revenue source without selling either excludable or non-excludable goods. Instead of trying to make money by selling stuff, the government makes money by charging people for doing stuff they have no right to do in the first place. From a minarchist point of view, the main strength of the Pigovian approach is also its main danger: the fuzziness of the rights the government is putatively trying to protect via taxation. Once government gets its revenue from taxing morally impermissible pollution, it has a strong incentive to move on to taxing morally questionable pollution, and then perhaps expand to morally innocent pollution. And due to the fuzziness, there will always be debate about whether the Pigovian tax authority is overstating its bounds. Compared to most public choice problems, though, this seems pretty mild, especially assuming the minimal state stays minimal. I'm not a minarchist. But if you are a minarchist, Pigovian taxation should excite you. A minimal state really can fund itself without begging for donations or politely robbing citizens at gunpoint. In fact, a truly minimal state could probably run permanent budget surpluses. What would minarchists do with their burgeoning sovereign wealth fund? Interesting question. January 16, 2015. Crazy equilibria, from democracy to anarcho-capitalism. Imagine advocating democracy 1,000 years ago. You sketch your basic idea. Every few years we'll have a free election. Anyone who wants power can run for office. Every adult gets a vote, and whoever gets the most votes runs the government until the next election. How would your contemporaries react? They would probably call you crazy. Why? Before you could even get to the second paragraph in your sales pitch, they'd interrupt. Do you seriously mean to tell us that if the ruling government loses the election, they'll peacefully hand the reins of power over to their rivals? Yeah, right. 1,000 years later, the planet is covered with democracies. In most of them, defeated incumbents consistently make the crazy decision to peacefully walk away from power. In long-standing democracies, this pattern is so familiar we take it for granted. But we shouldn't. The viability of democracy is an amazing fact that begs for an explanation. My explanation begins with a thought experiment. Picture a defeated incumbent in, say, Sweden. He summons his cronies to say, "So we lost a stupid election. Big deal. I say we refuse to cede power. If anyone protests, let's kill them." How would his cronies respond? At first, the cronies would think their leader was joking. A bad joke, but a joke. If he persisted, though, the cronies would deem their leader crazy. The only help they'd offer would be to call his family or a psychiatrist. If the Swedish leader pulled out a pistol and said, "If you're not with me, you're against me," his cronies would summon the police. If he kept waving his pistol around, the Swedish police would arrest him. End of coup. The lesson, crazy, is relative to expectations. 1,000 years ago, everyone was used to despotism. No one expected a defeated incumbent to voluntarily hand over power. As a result, refusing to hand over power didn't seem crazy. Since it didn't seem crazy, incumbents who refused to hand over power after losing an election probably would have managed to retain power. In modern Sweden, in contrast, everyone is used to democracy. Everyone expects a defeated incumbent to voluntarily hand over power. Refusing to hand over power seems crazy. As a result, refusing to hand over power would end not democracy, but the incumbent's career. Why bring this up? Because, like the Democrat of 1,000 years ago, I advocate a radical political change. Anarcho-Capitalism. After we've privatized everything else, I think we should privatize the police and courts and abolish the government. I know how crazy that sounds. I also know I'm not going to change anyone's mind about this in a blog post. This post has a more modest goal: to convince skeptics that one prominent argument against anarcho-capitalism is greatly overrated. The argument: do you seriously mean to tell us that privatized police companies will peacefully settle disputes instead of attacking each other until one firm becomes the new government? Yeah, right. Given current public opinion, this awful outcome is awfully likely. Everyone is used to the existence of government. If the police were suddenly replaced by a dozen private police firms, people would expect CEOs to say, "Let's attack the competition and become the new government." Since people would expect this, many CEOs would expect such a proposal to succeed, and some would advocate it. Since these CEOs wouldn't sound crazy, many of their underlings would go along with their plan, and their plan, or arrivals, would probably come to fruition. So far, so bad. Suppose, however, that a stable anarcho-capitalist system existed. Then this logic reverses. Since everyone is used to this system, people expect private police firms to amicably resolve disputes. In such a setting, a CEO who advocates a war of conquest would seem crazy, and his pleas to his coworkers would fall on deaf ears. In a stable anarcho-capitalist society, a warmongering CEO doesn't get a war. He gets fired. Since we've never had anarcho-capitalism, this peaceful equilibrium sounds like wishful thinking. But it's no more wishful thinking than stable democracy. Both systems sound crazy when first proposed. Neither can be stable as long as people expect them to be unstable. But both can be stable once people expect them to be stable. You could object. The expectations necessary to sustain anarcho-capitalism are highly unlikely to ever arrive. But the same was true for democracy 1,000 years ago. Yet somehow, expectations radically changed, and stable democracy arrived. How did expectations change so dramatically? It's complicated. But can expectations change dramatically? Absolutely. H.T. Bill Dickens for calling anarcho-capitalism nonsense on FB. April 2, 2013. America should open its borders. My opening statement for the reason: immigration debate. Under current U.S. law, it is illegal for a foreigner to work for a willing American employer or rent from a willing American landlord without government permission. For most foreigners, this permission is impossible to obtain. As a result, hundreds of millions who want to move here are stuck in their birth countries. Most would-be immigrants are desperately poor, but could easily work their way out of poverty if they were here. I say America should open its borders to them all. Every other country should do the same. But given America's illustrious open borders tradition, it is fitting that we lead the way. My case for open borders comes down to two claims. One moral, one empirical. The moral claim. Immigration restrictions are unjust. Letting people work for willing employers and rent from willing landlords is not charity. It's basic decency. And even though foreigners wickedly chose the wrong parents, they're clearly people. The empirical claim. Being just to foreigners would cost us less than nothing. When people immigrate here to work, they simultaneously enrich themselves and us. Though a high-skilled worker enriches us more than a low-skilled worker, the typical low-skilled worker is far better than nothing, and there's plenty of room for everyone. Let's start with our laws. Injustice. Imagine the U.S. made it illegal for blacks, women, or Jews to take certain jobs or live in certain neighborhoods. You wouldn't merely object. You'd be appalled. Whatever your specific moral views, you know it's wrong to prohibit a black, woman, or Jew from accepting a job or renting a home. My question: how is mandatory discrimination against foreigners less wrong than mandatory discrimination against blacks, women, or Jews? The leading rationale is that we should take care of our own first. That might be a good argument against sending foreigners welfare checks. But it's an Orwellian argument for stopping immigrants from working or renting here. Minding your own business when two strangers trade with each other is not a form of charity. This is not a weird libertarian point. The fact that I never put crazy glue in the locks of the Center for Immigration Studies does not make me one of its donors. Friends of immigration restrictions often compare nations to families. I'll accept their analogy. I love my children more than I love the rest of you put together. This is a good reason to worry that I'll treat you unjustly if there's ever a conflict of interest. But it's no excuse for me to treat you unjustly. I want my beloved son to get this job does not justify slashing rival candidates. Tires the morning of the final interview. The same goes for immigration policy. Your love for Americans may tempt you to treat foreigners unjustly, but it's no excuse for treating them unjustly. We should refrain from unjust actions even if they're in our self-interest. In the zombie apocalypse, you shouldn't eat me because you're hungry and I'm wimpy. Yet in the real world, fortunately, justice usually pays. Becoming a violent criminal is a poor path to prosperity. So were Jim Crow laws. What about immigration laws? This brings me to my second big claim. Being just to foreigners would cost us less than nothing. Everyone has his problems. Opponents of immigration spend most of their time staring at foreigners to find fault. But if you pick a random would-be immigrant, even a random illiterate peasant, and calmly weigh his positives and negatives for us, the sum is positive. To see why, you need a little labor economics. Hard fact: immigration laws trap people in countries where workers produce far below their potential. When Haitians move to the United States, their wages easily increase 20-fold. That's not plus 20%. It's plus 2,000%. The reason isn't that American employers are nicer than Haitian employers. The reason is that Haitians produce vastly more in America than they do in Haiti. Think about how little you could contribute to the world economy if you were stuck in Haiti. How much would total production rise under open borders? Every economist who asks the question reaches an astronomical answer. A typical estimate is that global free migration would double global production. If the U.S. alone opened its borders, the global effect would naturally be smaller, but the national effect would be even larger. How is vastly higher production in your self-interest? The obvious reason: more stuff produced means more stuff consumed. This is not trickle-down economics. It is Niagara Falls economics. Production is what distinguishes the rich world of today from the wretched world of the past. If half the workforce suddenly retired, it would be bad for you. Production always has its naysayers. When driverless cars arrive, you can count on people to complain that they're putting truck drivers out of work. But by this logic, we'd be richer if lawmakers in the 19th century banned the tractor. The fundamental truth of economic growth. While innovation often hurts immediate competitors, it is the fountainhead of rising prosperity. Doesn't immigration hurt workers by increasing the supply of labor? It's complicated, because immigration also increases labor demand. After all, workers buy stuff. To grasp immigration's full effect, keep both eyes on production. Trapping Mexican farm workers on primitive Mexican farms starves them and us. It's far better if they move here and enrich themselves by putting better and cheaper food on our tables. Like driverless cars, immigration can impoverish some Americans while enriching the rest. As a native-born research professor, I ought to know, thanks to an immigration loophole, about half the people in my occupation are foreign-born. Closing that loophole would give my career a big shot in the arm. Most labor economists similarly find that lower immigration helps native high school dropouts. How can I concede this, yet insist that illiterate foreigners are far better than nothing? Because, unlike Mark, I don't look at a would-be immigrant and ask, is there any possible downside? Instead, I ask, is his net effect positive? Every innovation is bad for someone, but innovation is still a good thing. Every immigrant is bad for someone, but immigrants are still a good thing. Why must I be so radical? In part because this is a matter of basic human rights. We don't have to give foreigners welfare or let them vote. But treating fellow human beings like criminals for working without government permission is unconscionable. What cements my radicalism, though, is that doing the right thing would cost us less than nothing. If you think production leads to poverty, open borders should terrify you. Otherwise, the sooner America opens its borders, the better. April 23, 2014. The case against libertarian Hispanophobia. When libertarians, as well as economically literate conservatives, worry about immigration, they usually focus on its undesirable political consequences. As my co-blogger Arnold puts it, the demographic picture, in which traditional Republican voting groups are shrinking as a proportion of the electorate, means that the Democrats have to worry less and less about alienating economic elites, as long as they can maintain an identity politics that appeals to non-whites. Given this view, libertarians may have the basic economics rights when it comes to open borders. Other things equal, more immigration is much better for the immigrants and somewhat better for the native population. But other things are not equal. Taking into account the effect of immigration on the political equilibrium, Steve Sailer may have it right. I've already criticized what I'll call libertarian Hispanophobia, but now I'd like to spell out my critique in greater detail. 1. The simplest libertarian political case against Hispanic immigration is that Hispanics are disproportionately Democratic. The obvious problem with this complaint is that, as the Clinton and Bush years illustrate, it's not obvious that Republicans actually offer more free market politics than Democrats do. Sure, Republican rhetoric is more libertarian, but Republican practice is at best only slightly better. Let's not forget how readily Bush paved the way for everything Obama's doing, or neglect Obama's premeditated flip-flop on NAFTA. In contrast, Democratic foreign policy has been noticeably more libertarian than Republicans for decades, at least if you buy the standard non-interventionist line. 2. Arnold worries that Hispanics, plus other demographic shifts, will turn the U.S. into a one-party state. A more plausible prediction is merely that Republicans will modify their platforms and rhetoric to stay competitive. As far as I can tell, though, the main way that Republicans, like Bush and McCain, try to improve their Hispanic vote share is A. supporting more liberal immigration policies, and B. showing respect for and sensitivity to Hispanic culture. In the absence of some other change in Republicans' positions, libertarians should be happy about these adjustments. 3. Well, maybe Republicans will also woo Hispanic voters by increasing support for the welfare state. I admit there's some plausibility to this. However, there is an important countervailing mechanism. Ethnic heterogeneity reduces mainstream support for the welfare state. Ethnically homogeneous countries like Sweden tend to have large welfare states because voters are happy to help people like them. Ethnically diverse countries like the U.S. have smaller welfare states because voters aren't so happy to help the other. As far as I know, no one has done a good job of estimating the net effect of immigration on support for the welfare state. But the answer is far from clear. 4. Almost 70% of American voters under the age of 30 voted for Obama. Why isn't anyone calling for the deportation of America's youth or limits on fertility to raise our average age? The reason, presumably, is that people realize that this would be a grotesque overreaction. Even if young voters are making America a little more socialist, the cure of mass exile is far worse than the disease. Libertarians should view arguments against Hispanic immigration in exactly the same way. Even if Steve Saylor were completely correct about the political consequences of Hispanic immigration, they're a small evil compared to the massive injustice of immigration restrictions. In fact, the moral imbalance is shocking. On the one hand, we have some libertarians fretting about the vague possibility that Hispanics might moderately increase the size of the welfare state. On the other hand, we have millions of Hispanics worrying that they might get deported back to the third world, and tens of millions more languishing in dire poverty in their home countries, when American employers would be happy to hire them. If anyone is more sinned against than sinning, it is the maligned Hispanic immigrant. Shouldn't libertarians be standing up for him, instead of respectfully weighing flimsy excuses for his continued persecution? May 18, 2009. Freedom-loving case for open borders. Robert Nozick famously criticized government for forbidding, quote, capitalist acts between consenting adults. If an employer wants to hire you and you want to work for him, government should leave you alone. If a landlord wants to rent to you and you want to rent from him, government should leave you alone. The right of consenting individuals to be left in peace by the government is the heart of freedom. It doesn't matter if the individuals are white or black, men or women, Christian or atheist. Consenting adults of all stripes have the right to engage in consensual capitalist acts. The case for open borders begins with a follow-up question. If race, gender, and religion don't matter here, why should nationality? Suppose I want to hire a Chinese citizen to work in my factory, and he wants to work in my factory. Or suppose I want to rent my apartment to a Romanian citizen, and she wants to accept my offer. It seems like government should leave us alone too. If it did, open borders. A world where every non-criminal is free to live and work in any country on earth would result. The main principled objection to this position is that countries are their citizens, collective property. Just as parents can legitimately say, my house, my rules, countries can say our house, our rules. Though even many libertarians sympathize with this argument, it undermines everything they think about human freedom. The idea that countries collectively belong to their citizens has a name, and the name is socialism. If your dad can mandate, as long as you live under my roof, you'll go to church, refrain from swearing, work in my restaurant, and stay away from that girl I don't like, why can't countries make comparably intrusive demands as long as you live within our borders? Authoritarians may bite this bullet, but freedom lovers must reject the premise. America is not the collective property of the American people, but the private property of American property owners. This brings us to the long list of pragmatic objections to open borders. We're short on time, so I'll make two sweeping points. First sweeping point. Immigration restrictions aren't just another impoverishing trade barrier. They are the greatest and most impoverishing trade barrier on Earth. According to standard estimates, open borders would roughly double the production of mankind by moving human talent from countries where it languishes to countries where it flourishes. Picture an upscale version of the migration-fueled economic growth that's modernizing China and India. Every advance hurts someone. See Uber. But open borders is not trickle-down economics. It's Niagara Falls economics. This enormous increase in wealth, greater than all other known policy reforms combined, far outweighs almost any downside of immigration you can imagine, or all of them combined. Second sweeping point, immigration restrictions are not a minor inconvenience we impose on foreigners for the greater good. To legally relocate to the United States, you need close relatives, incredible talent, or a winning lottery ticket. Since every country has similar policies, almost everyone who chooses to be born in the third world is stuck there, and being stuck there is very bad. How is their plight our problem? Because without our laws against capitalist acts between consenting adults, the global poor could pull themselves up by their own bootstraps in the global labor market. Freedom-loving people often fret that immigrants don't love freedom enough to come to the land of the free. They have a point. Most immigrants don't love freedom, but they're missing a larger point. Most native-born Americans don't love freedom either. See the 2016 election if you're in doubt. The real question is, do immigrants love freedom even less than native-born Americans? I've seen the data, and the answer is maybe a little, but immigrants don't vote much anyway. Sometimes, sacrificing a little freedom now brings much greater freedom in the long run. But for immigration restrictions, the opposite is true. They're a never-ending draconian violation of human freedom, where the long-run payoff is hazy at best. March 18, 2016.